Excellent. Thank you, Annette. So we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is the Wildland Urban Interface Code Technical Advisory Group. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start with roll call. And Annette, if you can take care of that. Do you have the roster in front of you, Annette?
I think so.
Okay. If not, I can do roll call because I think I have it from Stoyan here. Give me 1 second. I think Stoyan's stuck in the building tank.
Yeah.
Okay, I have it here. I'll go ahead and do a roll call. Okay, so Peter Reich.
Here. Riki.
I'm sorry. Sorry about
That's
that.
okay.
And as we go through, if you just want to introduce yourself, that way we know who we're dealing with on the tag. This is a new tag.
Yeah, I'm Pete Riki. I live in Pasco, Washington, and I'm officially the disability representative on the council. But Wildlands and Urban Interfaces is one of my, and parks and natural areas and that interface with my backyard and everybody else's backyard is a keen interest. I am not a fire person, but I'll learn a lot about that, I think.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome. Robert Hamlin. Okay. Guy Charles Gifford III.
Hi, my name is Guy. I work with the Department of Natural Resources as a community resilience assistant division manager. I live in Spokane, been a wildland firefighter for, I don't know, 35 to 37 years, and working with fire-wise sites, fire adapted community for about 17 to 20 years.
Excellent. Welcome, Guy.
And I'm also a forester as well, so I know a lot about the woods.
Excellent. Okay. And Dave Nakagawara, if I said that wrong, please correct.
No, that's correct. I'm Dave Nakagawara with the city of Port Townsend. I'm the building official here and also the fire code official. And I live in an intermix area, and most of my jurisdiction is within an interface. So
Excellent. Welcome.
thank you.
Steve Strong.
Afternoon. I'm Steve Strawn. I'm with Geldwin Windows and Doors, representing the manufacturing side. I live in the Portland, Oregon area, but I've been pretty involved in development of the Wildland Urban Interface Code, particularly with the California Code, and interested in helping to develop the next code for Washington.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Welcome. We have Grant Moeller as an alternate. Grant here.
That would be me. Yeah, I guess my picture isn't in, but I can't figure out how to share that.
That's okay. Well, welcome.
Oh, no, I'm sideways. Yeah, I, like Steve, have been involved in the Wildland Urban Interface subject specific fenestration and doors for 20 some odd years. Starting in California. I live in Kent, Washington. Currently co-chair of the WUI task group at FGIA, which was formerly AMA. So here to help as we can and educate when it comes to doors and windows and applications in the Wildland Urban Interface.
Excellent. Thank you, Grant. And Dave Cocott. I think you're on mute, Dave.
There goes. Sorry about that.
No,
my name is Dave Cocott. I'm the fire protection engineer with the Spokane Fire Department. I was on the fire code tag and actually the tag chair when the WUI code was first adopted as appendix of the fire code. So I have had some exposure to using the fire code with the WUI code. Spent some time also learning about the WUI code and how it operates as well. So I do have some background with that. And excuse me if I'm a little distant, but I'm actually in Boston attending the NFPA conference.
Excellent. Well, welcome, Dave. Thanks for attending. Brett Anderson. Not seeing him on here, so let's go to Curtis Banta. Okay, Erica Pfeiffer. Can't hear you, Erica. It's not showing that you're muted, but the audio is not coming through. So I don't know what's going on there, but I'll put you down as present. And if you can get your audio fixed, that would be great. And then we have alternate Jeanette McKay.
Yes, that's correct. I'm with Washington Realtors and have worked on this issue in the past.
Excellent. Okay. We have Richard Elliott.
Yeah, Rich Elliott with Kittitas Valley Fire and Rescue in Ellensburg. I'm representing fire chiefs and in the state level, and then also national level. I'm the chair of the IFC's Wildland Policy Committee, so we represent the nation's local government on wildland policy issues.
Excellent. Thanks, Rich. Welcome. Joseph Romero.
Hello, Joseph Romero, working with builders and developers, representing those fields.
Excellent. Welcome. Thank you. Okay, I think I got it all. So we have.
And Tony, I'm already here. Sorry, sorry, I was late.
No, that's okay. I'm showing 8 in attendance, so we have a quorum. And yeah, I'm sorry, I just saw that, Andrea. Andrea should be on this list, but I think she was a late ad. So Andrea Smith.
She was late at, yes, she's on the list.
Yes, Andrea, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. Just wanted to make sure I was on the list. And then for those of you that don't know me, Andrea Smith, BIW. And just a quick note on Curtis. I know that he's driving back from our state board meeting, so he may actually join us at some point. So just giving you a heads up.
Excellent. Okay, sounds good. All right, so my name is Tony Doan, and so I'll be chairing the WUI tag, the current chair of the fire tag, as well as the State Building Code Council. Unfortunate for some, no, I don't think it's going that bad. So we're excited to get this process started. It's been a long time in the works, and Stoyan and staff at SBCC have worked diligently to put this together. And they've also worked very hard on getting the proposal in front of us as well, those that are in the room. So we have Micah, Chappelle, and representatives from the Fire Marshals Association, as well as the Fire Chief Association, and a lot of parties that have come together to make this all happen. And so before we move forward, is there anyone from the public that is here that would like to be recognized?
I'm Chris Edmark. I'm with Thurston County.
Hi, Chris. Welcome.
Hi.
And John Weisman here, representing the Composite Lumber Manufacturers Association, which is composite decking. I'm not sure I'd like to be recognized, but I do want to let you know who I am and who I represent. So thank you.
Too late now, John. You are now recognized and welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, and
Craig Stevenson with the International Code Council.
Your mic's a little fuzzy, but Craig, welcome. And Micah, go ahead.
All right, Micah Chappelle. I work for Seattle's Department of Construction and Inspections as our Technical Code Committee Chair. I also represent Washington Association of Building Officials Technical Code Development Committee. I kind of chaired, I guess, the combined work group with WABO and the Washington State Fire Marshals Association for this proposal. And I also sit on the State Building Code Council representing code officials. So thank you, and you'll hear me talk a lot during this meeting, so I appreciate it, and we'll get to it shortly.
Thank you, Micah. Appreciate it. Okay. With that, we're going to move to agenda item number 2, which is review and approve the agenda, which is in front of us now. So take a look at that, and if anyone has any proposed changes, go ahead and speak up. Otherwise, we're looking to move this forward.
Mr. Chair, I move we approve the agenda.
Thank you, Dave.
Steve Strong, I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion from Dave and a second from Steve. Thank you. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any against? Okay, motion carries. Okay, let's move into what's going to take up most of the time, which is agenda item 3, which is reviewing the wildland urban interface proposal. We're gonna turn the floor over to Micah, and Micah, correct me if I'm wrong here, but in previous discussions, I think the idea for today's meeting, and because of our time crunch and as far as trying to get this in front of council, what we'd like to accomplish today is to get through the proposal as a whole and probably not stop and tackle everything that might warrant discussion today. Maybe some clarifying questions, a few comments here and there, but we want to get through exactly what is going to be proposed. And so, Micah, if you're okay with that, that's kind of how you foresee this. That's how I'd like to tackle it. Are you good with that?
I'm perfectly fine with that. That sounds like a great plan. I know maybe there's some additional modifications that folks want to make or suggest, and we still have time to do that. Again, today, the tag for those of you that maybe have not participated in a technical advisory group, it just makes a recommendation whether or not to approve what's submitted and move that forward to the Building, Fire, Plumbing Committee. And then that body again would hear this similar information, additional changes if necessary, and then they would make it another recommendation to move this on to council, the full council. In between there will be some public comment hearings that the council will conduct, and so there will be additional time to provide some more modifications if necessary. Hopefully that won't be the case considering the work group that was involved in developing this, but we do have some areas in here I think that will be up for negotiation, to say the least. But I appreciate everybody's time and work on this, and we do at the end need a recommendation from this body for approval or disapproval moving the proposals forward. There are three. This one that's on the screen is going to be the biggest portion of it. It is the actual WUI code itself. And then the other two are optional portions that can be included into chapter 3. And I'll explain those a little later when we get into them, when we get into those proposals. Actually, when we get to chapter 3, I'll kind of explain the thoughts behind the other two proposals and why we think they should go into chapter 3. And then we can discuss those after everything's done. So with that, I guess we're ready to kick this off.
Yeah, Micah,
we got a hand up.
Real quick, just before I forget, and Andrea, we'll get to you in just a second here. I do want to just thank the TAG members who are able to make it today and who did, because this was kind of on short notice, and staff worked diligently to try and get this put together and to try to stay on some timelines that will be beneficial to the council process as a whole. So thank you to everyone for showing up and getting us a quorum. That means a lot for moving this forward. Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it would be beneficial for some of those that weren't like involved in the process of this to maybe have like a background of like how we got here first.
Sure.
Thank
so thank you, Andrea. Micah might be able to say this more eloquently than I can. It's not might, actually, he could, but I'm going to try and just put this in a nutshell for everyone. So what took place is there was some legislative language that went through in the last code cycle that basically gave us portions of the wildland urban interface that the state had to follow. But there was some lack of clarity in direction and how to get to those portions in a clear path in the wildland urban interface code without the rest of it. But it was up to the jurisdiction to adopt the rest of it. And so it was just very difficult to find a clear path. Part of that was mapping requirements that were state mandated by the legislator to be provided by Department of Natural Resources. When they did provide that mapping, and they worked very hard to get that mapping in place in a decent time frame and what they were squeezed into, the mapping at a glance is very unclear because it's not micro-pixelated. That's a Micah term. I learned that last year. So you could not zoom in and then like say this property line is where it stops and the next property line is not. It was just unclear. And so that left jurisdictions with having to come up with their own GIS mapping through their local jurisdiction to be able to define those areas. And so some of that was unclear. And so the idea is that going through the TAG process, we clean this up, we make it a more defined path for jurisdictions and for code officials to be able to practically apply this and know what path they need to take. And so that's the idea behind it. It will have a significant effect on authorities having jurisdiction, as well as those communities and where those lines fall. And so that's the intent behind it. And this is trying to clear that up. And if Micah or anyone else or staff, if Stoyan, you have something to add to kind of add a wrinkle to that, feel free.
No, it was perfectly fine explanation.
Agreed. I think it was still better than what I would have said.
Okay, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, for the purposes of our review, I was just seeking a clarification question that the changes that are being proposed are to the base document being the 2018 International WUI code.
It would be the 2021. This would be
2021.
2021, okay. Which would be effective July 1 of 23.
Okay, so I am to ignore any previous copies of a Washington State Wildland Urban Interface Code based on the 2018. All these changes are shown to be either strikeouts or additions to the 2021.
That's correct, Dave.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Jeanette, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess one of the questions I have, because the legislature put this framework together, and if there were issues, I'm surprised that there wasn't more action to actually take that message back to the legislature and work within those committees to get these changes rather than coming back. So I haven't heard if there were any of those kind of actions taken, but certainly when the legislature lays out a framework, and it doesn't always work, that's for sure, but I think, the framework that they put out there needs to be respected, or at least talk to them about what's not working for local jurisdictions. So
that's a good point, Jeanette. And Micah raised his hand right away. And so I can let him speak on that, but just quickly, I think there's been a lot of talk at the TAG and council level that the best place to put in code and to take it through the right process is through the State Building Code Council, taking it to a TAG, discussing it, taking it to the committees, taking it to council, and vetting that whole process. I'll leave it at that. Micah, go ahead.
I was going to say, yes, Jeanette, it's a great question. We have considered that, and we are starting those conversations. Before we got into this work, we made a determination whether or not we would approach the legislators before last legislative cycle. Unfortunately, it was just so close to it, as within like a 6-week window. We didn't feel we could get the legislation modified in time. So we have reached out to Craig Stevenson. He's on this call. And I know that our previous discussions with him, he helped spearhead that legislation through the state representing ICC, is that we are going to be reaching out to the original proponents of the legislation that went through and get them to modify that to where it will more or less go away. However, we're going to adopt the full code like we adopt the other codes and have those edited and modified through the State Building Code Council Act. So that is in the works. We just couldn't get that legislation rescinded or modified in the last cycle because it was just too close to the window to get it done. So we will be doing that in conjunction with getting this, in coordination with getting this code change approved and updated. So that the path forward that we felt best through the work group was to develop the full code and take that as a package to those legislatures and say, look, we are not getting rid of the work you've already done. We're just getting it in a different format, technically the appropriate format of rulemaking through the Washington Administrative Code, that is the State Building Code Act. So again, we're really not getting rid of their framework, and that will be part of the discussion today when we get into Chapter 5. We are keeping most of the language that is in that legislation. We're just going about it a different path. So those discussions have been started. And again, like I said, Craig Stevenson is on this call. If he has his audio working, he can maybe speak a little more to that original legislation and what we're going to be doing moving forward into the next legislative cycle to get that RCW 1927-560, I believe is the number, modified to incorporate this correctly. So good question. Hopefully that answers your thoughts on that. If I see other hands go up, so I'll put mine, go from there.
Excellent. And Dave, do you have anything further?
No,
No,
I
I
don't.
don't.
Okay. All right. And Andrea?
Yeah, sorry. So just to clarify, Micah, the proposals that we're going to look at today are only inclusive of the 4 areas of the WUI code that are directly referenced in statute that was passed, I think, in 2018. I guess my question is, are we going above and beyond what we were authorized to do?
That has been the question, and we approached and Tony, you were in that meeting with me, as well as Stoyan, and maybe Stoyan can answer that with Dirk, our representative at the Attorney General's office. And the answer is yes, we can do this. And yes, we are, verified that is legally allowed in the process we're going through. And Stoyan, maybe you can expand on that, or even Tony, if you want to.
Well, I better not expand more because I'm not an attorney, but I want to clarify a wrong impression that I see. Sorry, I didn't see my video itself. So our Assistant Attorney General, I mentioned it in the previous meeting, he won't give you a direction, go ahead. He can evaluate the issue and outline, possible outcomes. So for this particular one, I don't think he suggested we have legal issues with the proposal that Micah has. And again, I don't want to go into too much of a legal explanation because I don't feel this is my best area of expertise. But for the technical advisory group meeting, based on the coordination we had with the Assistant Attorney General, I think Micah's proposal doesn't go above and beyond.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Craig, go ahead.
I'll unmute here. I'm sure you can hear me better with my headset on. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah, I had some difficulty with this computer when testimony was given, I think last October, and the correction to it is for me to put on my headset. So I'm not a committee member on the tag, so I want to respect the fact that you've got work to do. I work in about 7 different states, and it's never appreciated to have somebody that's not on task in a code evaluation subcommittee to hog all the time. But yes, I was very involved with a lot of stakeholders to get something into the statute, and recognize that Senator Kevin Van de Weg worked, even when he was in the House, for many, many years to try to get the entire code adopted. We have other states that are working on adopting this code or have adopted it. And the discussions around how do you map, how much fuels reduction happens, and what do you do to a structure to mitigate these concerns has been difficult for all governments to deal with, because it usually involves 3 different disciplines. So I understand those challenges. Senator Van de Weg felt okay that if he reached out to the stakeholders back in, I think it was 2008, it might have been Senate Bill 6109, that he would write in those issues that he felt was most important and write it into statute. That's how it occurred. Up until that time, there was not the ability to get stakeholders on board to adopt the entire code. Obviously, working for ICC, we feel that it's the comprehensive full document that should be adopted, but nonetheless, the legislation that passed felt by Senator Van de Weg that this was a starting point, that it'd get something on the books. We'd already suffered many wildfire hazards. He wanted to make sure that he addressed the things that he thought he could get through in a piece of legislation. As Jeanette McCaig has said, that doesn't mean that legislation is always perfect. Knowing that this process was very well described and the short timelines, that means that this will be proposed, I guess, through maybe a CR 103. That still gives opportunity for people to give public comment to the State Building Code Council in October and September, I believe it is. Rules would be prepared in the late fall. And as per the statute, the rules would have to set through the legislature. So there's plenty of opportunity for this committee to do some good work that takes the comments from these stakeholders that you could then have a much better picture by learning from each other and having a great discussion with legislators if this process goes that far. So I'll leave my comments at that, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Craig. Well said. Okay. Micah, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks everybody so far for the good questions. One more thing I wanted to add for Andrea is what was put in legislation, and we'll kind of discuss this more in Chapter 5, is more the most restrictive ignition resistant construction requirements. And so what we're doing is providing some alternative to that. And so that's what we'll get into with going through this. So with that, again, I want to thank you for everybody's time. I will try to run through this somewhat quickly. If you do have some questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to get to those again. Like Tony mentioned, let's try not to debate a whole lot of the language right now. If we do have some changes you want to recommend, let's do that kind of as we move forward down the road, and maybe not in today's meeting, because it seems like we probably have a lot to get through in the first meeting and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So with that, we'll just jump into it. I want to thank everybody that's on. If you look up at the proposal and all the names that were on that who were involved with us, I really appreciate all that time and energy. There were a lot of meetings. There was a lot of stakeholder input. There was a lot of discussion from folks around the state. Even the folks that are not listed on the proposal, there was a lot of other stakeholders that were involved. So I want to just say a thank you to them. This is a lot of work and a big lift. I kind of giggle at the level of fire folks that are involved here on the tag and on the proposal, and somehow my name is on it first, and I'm not sure why. So again, I want to thank everybody. I'm not the expert by any means, but I have worked in this field, like others have mentioned, in California. I did move from there previously. And then when it came up to our state level, again, I represent Washington Association of Building Officials on their executive board as their technical code committee chair. And a lot of concerns happened in our meetings, our quarterly meetings for WABO. And so that's how we got involved with this and making some changes. So I appreciate everybody's time, and let's move on. So I'm just going to run through these. So starting out with 101.2, there were some questions on what a distinct danger to life or property would be. Again, that's open to subjective thought or consideration. So we decided to put in a term, an unmitigated danger. In other words, we always feel, at least in my opinion, we feel there are methods to mitigate some of these issues without going to the full WUI code as a solution. So that's kind of what it is. We didn't there was no definition of what distinct danger was. And we wanted to provide something that's kind of a little more consistent across the field that could be enforced a little more justifiably, let's just say. We did the same thing in 101.4 under retroactivity. Again, it's going to be determined by the code official. And if it's an unmitigated hazard, then you would have to meet the requirements of this code. In other words, we just didn't want this to apply if somebody goes, oh, your vegetation is wrong and that's a distinct hazard, you have to come in and comply with the entire WUI code. That wouldn't really be a fair interpretation of this. So we wanted to make sure that there's the opportunity for folks to mitigate the issue that is identified without necessarily having to bring up the entire requirements of the WUI code to do that. All right, scrolling down. I think that's the majority of what we did in Chapter 1, just based on the fact that we know several jurisdictions modify or write their own Chapter 1 for their administrative portion as allowed by Washington law. One of the things I do want to point out in this, you'll see a lot of at the footers or headers of the page, 2021 Seattle Wildland Urban Interface Code. we do our own work in Seattle. And so we get the base files and then we put those into a Word document. So just ignore that. That won't be on the final version by any means. It was just the working document that I had at the time and that we used in the work group. It was the easiest way to get a full Word version of this for editing. So if you do see that, I think that came up at one of my other meetings, says, hey, this says Seattle on it. This is not Seattle's. We just adopt our own codes. And so when I do that work, that's how it gets there. So there you go. You can see that. Those will all be gone. It will just say 2021 Wildland Urban Interface Code or Washington Wildland Urban Interface Code. Again, just want to point that one out. We got a hand up. Go ahead, Chris.
You know, I really loved your explanation, but I'm afraid that people are going to read that wrong. Is it possible to add a definition? Just that lovely explanation you gave.
Of the unmitigated issue?
Yes. Yes.
There possibly would be. And I think if you had an opportunity to put something together, I'd be open to that. If you're saying what I said was fine, we could definitely go back to the recording.
I really like the way you explained it. I did.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great. All right. If we can move on down to chapter 2 again, I believe that was the easiest portion of what we did. So this is where, Chris, we would put in a definition that you suggested. The next one we put in here is accessory structure. I'm okay with this. I'm not a big fan of it. We're having a lot of discussion at the state, especially in the residential code, on accessory dwelling units. Technically, an accessory dwelling unit doesn't exist in the codes. It's just a dwelling unit. Dwelling units are dwelling units. So this is kind of, maybe this clarifies it a little more to where the accessory structure with this additional language could be a habitable building or structure that is accessory to and incidental to that of the dwelling. A lot of what we mean here, at least in my opinion, and others that were on the work group can clarify that. If you have a detached garage and say you convert that into a TV room, it's not an accessory dwelling unit or a secondary dwelling unit. It's just an accessory habitable space to the primary residence. So that would, that's what this indicates in my opinion. Again, others can jump in and say that's different, but that's what this means, because your dwelling units, they're not accessory to another dwelling unit, or accessory dwelling unit is not accessory or incidental use to another dwelling unit. It's an actual dwelling unit. So we wanted to kind of clarify that a little bit. And if that doesn't capture it, I know we're open to suggestions. Next change here would be striking building official. You've already got code official right there below it, 2 definitions down. Those are interchangeable in our opinion. A code official is a code official. That could be an inspector, a fire code official, a building official, a building code, building inspector, plans examiner. Those are all considered code officials. It's just someone who enforces the code. So we didn't feel that redundant definition necessarily was needed. All right. Moving into the fuel information here, we have changed, we haven't changed. The appendices in these instances are necessary for the changes we made throughout the code. And so what this does is we're moving those from an appendix to an actual chapter, and we just wanted to change those references. We've done that in several locations. You'll see we don't have to go through all of them. And then the final one in the definitions that we modified was wildland urban interface. So as most of you folks that are on here, especially the folks that have worked in this and that are smarter in this than I am, interface and intermix are technically interchangeable terms depending on the layout of the structures within that area. So they're both going to apply. You're not going to call one an interface and intermix and then have different requirements. They're both going to have the same requirements when you get further into the code. So those terms are interchangeable. I just wanted to make sure we added intermix because a lot of folks get confused with that, at least the ones I have dealt with. They're like, what's the difference? Well, technically it's number of structures and amount of vegetation, and that's it. The code will still apply to both of them in a similar fashion. Any questions on chapter 2? Got a hand up? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, so subsequent references in the code to interface, of which there's quite a few, is going to be synonymous with intermix areas.
Correct.
So this is the place where it kind of sets them equivalent, and there's no need for any further discussion on that probably, right?
That would be my interpretation. However, others may interpret that differently. I would
Yeah,
say yes to that.
Okay, I was just curious because there's a lot of future references to interface alone. So I was looking for where that gets tied together. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is going to tie into the mapping at the state level, the DNR mapping. If you look at that mapping, the two colors that are important on that mapping are the red and the yellow. That's interface or intermix. And when you get in there, it just says, hey, the WUI code is going to apply in those areas. So it is. So hopefully it answers your question. Yes, Chris.
Let me unmute myself. Where's my mute? Oh,
You're good.
there it
We
is.
hear you. Oh, you muted
Okay.
yourself.
Okay.
Oh, now you muted.
You're muted now, Chris.
I agree with Dave that that you will find people that say, well, it doesn't say intermix. It may, again, it may just a statement in the beginning of the chapter 1 or say that where the code refers to the interface, it also means to apply to the intermix area. That's an easy fix to just put that in the front of the code.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I'm writing some of this down. So folks, I'm not ignoring you. Maybe Storian or somebody else writing it down. I'll write it down. All right. If there's no other questions or comments on chapter 2, we'll move into chapter 3. So this is the area that talks about the area designations. If you want to scroll down just a little more, that really encompasses chapter 3 right there. It's one page. However, we may want to add to it with a worksheet, quick sheet, informational sheet, however we want to classify that later. Oops, we got work going back and forth. I could see the code chat. Thank you, who's ever controlling the screen. What we did here is kind of just some cleanup, but then we're talking about findings of fact, and finding of fact is in the legislation. So obviously the legislative body shall declare the wildland urban interface within a jurisdiction. And we got rid of that because it needs to be based on findings of fact. And each individual jurisdiction is allowed to make that finding of fact or make findings of fact that may differ from the DNR mapping as well. I'm not sure if everyone's aware of that. That is allowed. There was supposed to be some funding in the legislation that could help with that. However, there is no funding available for that. And if anybody has questions on that, we can point to Craig Stevenson and maybe he can answer more on that. However, let me see. I got a hand up. Go ahead, Eric.
I had a question about the link. It doesn't seem to work.
Is this
The
the link?
WADNR link.
Oh,
Okay. That's something we'll have to verify.
It
seems
does
like they
not
keep
work,
changing.
but it's easy to find online. So
And we'll see if we can find an actual link that gets you somewhere close. It seems like they move that link or change it every other week. I think we had one on the State Building Code Council website at one point, and that one doesn't work either. So I apologize, but thank you for pointing that out, Erica. We'll work on, maybe we'll get in someone from DNR to give us a hand on what link would be the best, at least get to their main website, even if it's to search for the mapping. And then we have another hand up, and maybe Tony, you wanted to say something too.
no, go ahead, Peter.
yeah, I checked out the map quite carefully to see where I existed in this, and apparently my property boundary is right up against an intermix zone, but that's clearly not appropriate. So the DNR maps have a lot of issues associated with them at this time. They're either out of date or misinterpreted, probably because they had to put them together quite so quickly. So I think it's important here that the finding of fact and the ability of the jurisdiction to be able to look at that and say, no, this is not correct is really kind of important at this particular point, at least until a DNR gets their maps more micro-pixelated, I guess. So.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Chris, go ahead.
I had a suggestion that I would like to make, because we don't, again, I'm resource driven, which we don't have the resources, but In lieu of finding of fact, would it be possible to allow a jurisdiction to choose either to designate all additions and remodels have to comply with Chapter 4 and Section 503, which is the most stringent of the applications to buildings, you know, the windows, the things like that, or have the applicant give them an option to either submit a fire protection plan prepared by a Washington State licensed design professional, or provide a mapping determination prepared by a Washington State licensed design professional. One of my, and again, I'm sure you're going to get into this later, and maybe you can explain it now, but to determine where that 40 acres has to be taken and the shape of the acreage, it seems like, again, without having all that knowledge, it's not something I really think I want plans examiners to have to do on a daily basis. And we just don't have the ability to map resources. That we might be able to find some professional that would be able to do that for our applicants.
Okay, that's a good question and point. I think we addressed that in here, and I think we'll answer that as we move through. Part of one of the other proposals is kind of a worksheet on how to view the map, how it applies to the 40 acres, and how to make a determination or finding of fact. And that can be done in coordination with your building department, fire department, or it can be done by an applicant or an applicant's representative. And that's kind of what we're trying to do is provide that guidance and cleanup throughout the code so we can give you those answers, because they're not in the RCW as currently written. So I think we're going to answer that question as we move forward, Chris, or concern. Okay. Do you have something, Tony, beyond that? I think you came on to.
No, continue, Micah.
Okay, thanks. So again, 302.2 talks about the finding of fact, and it talks about being permitted in following either a table or worksheet, whatever we want to call this, one of the other following proposals we have on how to get here. It may not go through it all, but you are able to do that finding of fact, whether that's the applicant doing it in approval by the code official or the jurisdiction, and then sending that on to DNR for updated mapping. And that actually is talked about in here in 302.3 and 302.4. Again, this points to the mapping. That was a concern that the code officials had. There is no direct tie in the RCW to the map. It says a mapping shall be done, but it doesn't say you have to use the mapping for anything for enforcement of the WUI code. However, we know the intent was to go to the mapping for determining interface or intermix for enforcement of this code. And the worksheet, spreadsheet type thing that we're going to get to later, hopefully will give direction on how to do that. And that's where we need to update the link, I believe. And then 302.4 talks about the code official reviewing for approval, evaluating the areas or modified findings of fact. They can make a determination whether or not they actually fall in the WUI or not, and based on the information from the applicant. The code official does not have to do that work. That work can be done by the applicant. It just needs to be reviewed and approved by the code official. And then the code official should provide that to DNR so they can update their mapping. And that is spelled out in the legislation. So this is not, like I said, this is not going beyond or above or outside of what's allowed or required in the legislation. That's chapter 3. Again, we do have we have two options later, a table or a worksheet, quick sheet type item to possibly include in here on how to do those findings of facts. So we'll discuss that later if that's okay with everybody. We'll just get through the code itself first. Great. Any additional questions on chapter 3 before we move to chapter 4? Silence is good, I suppose. Maybe it's bad. Okay. Let's move on to chapter 4, if we can. Who's ever controlling the screen for me? All right. So this was a bigger sticking point that has other laws, state laws involved. And so there's mostly a lot of strike through in chapter 4. Because most of, say, street standards, road designs, water supplies, all those things are regulated by the local jurisdiction, whether that's a county or city. And so that's why a lot of this just so strike through and says, shall comply with locally adopted standards, because other state laws say the state doesn't regulate this. It's regulated by the jurisdiction. So that's what we're going to kind of scroll through in this. Again, most of this first page is strike through, pointing to the locally adopted standards. Then we get into some access. The access, again, is not, there's not a lot to it. One thing we wanted to keep, where did you scroll to? Did I miss something? Let's go to the next page, please. Sorry. I have my own screen open too, so I can keep up with where I'm at. The access one here, the reason we kept the restricted access information here in the driveways, if you go back to the RCW, some of this information is in the RCW. Again, we wanted to try to align with 560 and not get outside of what they put in the legislation. Although we'd like to get them to remove that legislation, we are going to keep those negotiated items in here in some way, shape, or form. Other than that, we start to strike other sections. Again, that's going to be per your locally adopted standard. The dimensions are not there. If your jurisdiction adopts Appendix D of the fire code for access, you'll have to meet some of those requirements. If they don't, maybe it's through a land use requirement or something else. So that's why a lot of this is strike through. Again, we get down into turnarounds. This information, 403.24, if you want to scroll just a little bit, that gets into, again, more of the stuff that's already in the RCW. Negotiated items with information. We just kept it. We brought it over. It's almost, I think it's verbatim per the RCW. And that's what we try to do is keep some of that legislative language. Then we got into other items and did some strike through. Bridges are not mentioned in a lot of places. Again, this is going to be up to your local jurisdiction more or less and the code official on how that should be done. All right, moving down to the fire apparatus access road. Again, I mentioned that before. That's not regulated at the state level. Your jurisdiction has control over that. And so that's why we provided that language that says provide and maintain as required by locally adopted street, road, and access standards. We thought that language captured what the intent of this section should be. And again, it's regulated by your jurisdiction. Then moving down to 403, then we struck the rest of that section, 403.34, 403.41. We did keep the marking and for address marking for areas that fall within a wildland urban, that fall within this code, I should say, I mean, shorten that. We did feel this was appropriate to keep. It's something fairly easy, and it will provide, you know, some identification of access or addresses for responding personnel. Then the grade, we decided not to change that either. Again, the access roads and driveways, that can be set by your local jurisdiction or your code official and approved as such. That was standard language. So then we're going to move on down to water supply. Easiest part of this is it's almost all strikeout because it's per your locally adopted standards. That's it. That's what we cover under water supply. So the entirety of 404 pretty much has a strike through. So we move on down to a fire protection plan. 405. So Chris, I believe this is what you mentioned talking about the availability of using a fire protection plan to make changes or different determinations when you're working on a finding of fact. We kept this in here. And we did, I want to say there's an example or other portions of fire protection plan in the appendices that I want to say we moved up into as a chapter. So we make sure it's adopted at the state level instead of just an appendix. And then I have a question from Erica.
Yeah, it says the fire protection plan will be kept by the code official. How does it help the firefighters trying to fight the fire?
That's a good question. That may be given to the fire code official as well. as probably, and Tony, it looks like you were going to say something on that. I don't have that answer. Maybe some of the fire code officials on here could talk about their operational plan with these fire protection plans.
So just in my experience, when it comes to fire safety plans, evacuation plans in the fire code, and other items, and more than welcome to hear some other code officials' recommendations and opinions on this, but we have to keep in mind that the international codes are not written specifically for any one entity that it covers. When you look at the scope and intent of a fire code or a wildland urban interface code, it talks about who the code is written for, and it's really for everyone. And so this section of the code and having a fire protection plan and providing that to your code official in this case, that easily can be related to suppression personnel who may be responding. However, there's also an accountability measure that fire protection plan basically puts into place for the occupant or for the person who is in that area. And so that's just kind of something to keep in mind as far as who that code is written for. Because it's applied to the code official, it does not mean it's necessarily excluding anyone. It's putting the occupant or that person who's responsible for carrying forth that plan. That puts the responsibility on them because the code's also for them. And then in turn, the code official can pass that on to their suppression personnel, which sometimes it's clear who those people are and sometimes it's not. And then that would be up to the code official to carry that forward. Chris, go ahead.
I was just going to explain that in our jurisdiction, we are not the fire department. We are just the fire marshal, and the fire districts, we have, what, 16 of them? So it's going to be difficult for us to determine, oh, this needs to go to so-and-so, this needs to go to so-and-so. We would retain it, but the fire districts would have to make a request to get copies of it. We might be able to have some kind of, in the day and age of electronics, we might be able to run a fire district report based on area. Yeah, I think that at first I had kind of reservations about this, but yeah, I think we can take care of that.
Thanks, Chris. I think another point for me on this section, I don't mean to cut somebody off, would be that this is actually a document that will help in determining findings of fact. When we get into chapter 5, you'll see that you have a path to change your fire hazard severity or your fire hazard classification. And so this is part of that. That fire protection plan is going to be part of that assessment. And so this will be a document that says, hey, this is how you got to be allowed to, say, provide a class 3 ignition resistant construction or part of that. And so this will also be an enforcement document down the road when, if they come in and they go, hey, we want to add another structure or add on to our house, and you have to do another wildland urban interface review and determine whether or not they are within the urban interface. Like some of these protection plans can be used to get out of a wildland urban interface area, intermix or interface, surprisingly enough. So I think this ties into that document for enforcement down the road as well, not just for a fire protection plan for responders to use. This is actually for your structures and your parcel and how we enforce that in the future as well. And then Peter, you have to stand up, and so does Dave. They're going to correct me, hopefully.
I just wanted to make a comment. Maybe it should be re-entitled Fire Defensibility Plan as opposed to Protection Plan, with the idea that this is something you do prior to a fire, not during the fire. I think there was a little confusion about whether or not firefighters would need this plan in hand during a fire. So maybe I missed.
Thank you, Peter. Go ahead, Dave.
I agree with where Micah was going with this, but I don't think it says it very well. Is that we basically say they create a plan, but I think we need to add in some language that with changes to the location, changes to the construction in the area, with modifications to the site, the plan needs to be updated and resubmitted for review and approval by the code. That way I think it makes it a little bit clearer.
Okay, thanks. everybody for those suggestions.
Um,
I'm totally open to changing this. Again, this was just base code language that we felt was important to be able to have in there. So if we want to change it, that's something that TAG can definitely explore. And I see other hands up. Go ahead, Guy.
I guess I think Peter might have hit what I was going to comment on. Usually when we're working with communities and homeowners, this is for the homeowner to do, for the home to survive without fire suppression. And so usually this stuff, you know, when I'm working with firewise sites and that, we're trying to get set up so fire suppression isn't needed for home survivability. So I think calling, you know, these aren't suppression plans. These are, like someone said, preparedness plans to get things ready before the fire happens. And so I, as a firefighter, sorry, I'm not going to read this. If someone sends this to me, I'm responding to a fire. I'm not reading a fire protection plan for the house at a certain address. When I get there, I make my own evaluation because none of these plans stand up as soon as summer hits. It might have been great last year, but it may not be any good this year because the guy ran out of water. So we still got to do site evaluation as we respond to the fire.
Thank you, Guy. Dave, do you have anything further? Okay.
I do not. I'm just in a different time zone, so it takes longer to take my hand down.
Thanks, Dave. Go ahead, Micah.
Okay. I think that's all good suggestions. If those folks that mentioned a few ways to modify this or think we should modify that, if you wouldn't mind, you know, grabbing this language somehow and providing some recommended changes to that, that would be really helpful moving forward. So again, it was just base code language and I have no problem changing it at all. I'm open to changing anything. So, all right. Any other questions on chapter 4? Go ahead, Guy.
I got another question. Who writes these fire protection plan, or is that part of this code, or how is someone qualified to write a fire protection plan? Is that coming further along in this?
Go ahead. Is that you, Tony?
Yeah, sorry. I didn't
Go
mean
ahead.
to step on you there. I just, this kind of goes back to what I was kind of trying to explain earlier, that this is a responsibility of the applicant, of the person applying. And so it would be their responsibility to provide what that plan is. Now, what route they wanted to go with that, I don't think it's specified in here as far as they need a PE or a licensed designer, anything like that. But it would be the responsibility of the applicant to come up with that. And if the applicant, it would be up to the jurisdiction, I suppose, at that point. But if the applicant decided that they could, you know, come up with a plan, then, and the jurisdiction decided to accept it, then they could. If they didn't feel comfortable with that and wanted to hire someone, then that would be their right also. But the responsibility ultimately falls on the applicant.
All right, so there's no going to be criteria what in these plans or the skill set of the person filling out the plan or advising them. I guess one of the things I'm trying to get away from is, you know, we do a lot of these risk assessments around structures, the state, the fire districts, the conservation districts. We don't want to be in the business, as an educational tool, we don't want to get into code writing or writing plans for code enforcement. So that's, I guess, where my question is going on this. Is we're doing education, not code, and how will that get spun when the landowner realizes, hey, I'll come out and walk your home, give you recommendations based on everything you've written here, but I'm not writing it for code enforcement or for them to get a building permit or whatever this plan is used for.
Yeah, I think that comes down to just understanding the role of the code official, and depending on what role you're in, and you just have to be careful in how you tackle these approvals, because, you know, really you would just point them back to the code and say, this is what it has to meet, and it's either reviewed for code compliance and approved or not, and they would have, or for compliance, and they would have to come back and come back with something else. I mean, that's how I view the role of the code official, and not being in a designer role. And I don't know, Micah, if you agree with that or not, but.
Yeah, I think that works. I do understand some of the concerns. I'm just not sure how to answer that in this code section.
This is one of the sticky wickets we've been dealing with insurance companies telling people to call a DNR to get a, fire inspection so that they can keep their insurance, and we don't do those. We do educational inspections, not insurance inspections. This is not me, it's fire districts as well. When I say me, I mean all of us who do these as an educational tool. And this is just that saying, to me, this is really no different than an insurance company wanting some certification that they meet certain standards.
Okay.
I just think it's being a problem for us.
Okay.
We can let that maybe.
Sorry, I'm actually processing. I did a word search on fire protection plan in the 2021 code, and it does have a definition. If we want to go back up to the definition of what this is, and it kind of explains what it's for. So if we wouldn't mind, whoever has the controls here, it says a document prepared for the specific project or development proposed for the wildland urban interface area. It describes ways to minimize and mitigate the fire problems created by the project or development with the purpose of reducing impact on the community's fire protection delivery system. So that's what the fire protection plan is defined as. So it kind of gives specifics on why it's there. And, you know, it talks about mitigating those issues with that are created by the development. And I'm not sure who wants to, you know, have that or take that. I think it's just an assessment tool for the code official to, you know, implement the WUI code on certain projects. I'll stop talking. Go ahead, Chris.
Really quick. It says where required by the code official. The code official doesn't need to ask for it at all. So you can make it what you want. Shall be prepared by, and you could have a policy. Fire protection plans are prepared by blank. It's up to the jurisdiction whether or not you've got a big development that's going right next to Capitol Forest, and you might feel that you need that. You might not.
In 405.3 does say that the cost of the fire protection plan shall be the responsibility of the applicant. So it sounds like the applicant would be responsible for providing that. And I understand there's no direct qualifications here in the code for that, as I'm finding so far. Sorry, go ahead, Dave, and then Joseph.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time on this, but I thought about the same thing. I think there is going to be some latitude for local code officials to be able to determine who does those reports, because ostensibly, you know, they're being used to possibly get yourself out of the map, so to speak. But, you know, you're supposed to mix a few factors in there. Could be everything from climate, topography, vegetation, and assessment of the project itself in relation to its environment. So, yeah, there's some close to engineering practices taking place there. So, you know, my natural inclination would be to do that, to make some sort of requirements, just like we do with any other type of construction applications. But yeah, I'm sure with our industry partners in on this call, it's going to be a point of interest for sure, because there could be some uneven application of that. I could see some jurisdictions maybe even coming up with a pro forma type of report format. And so just a couple thoughts.
Joseph, go ahead.
I appreciate the time. I'm a later addition to this tag and have not been under review with the same things as many of the members. So I'm trying to gain an understanding as we move forward. I'm currently on the Wildland Urban Interface WUI map for Washington State, and just really want to understand what I'm looking at. Obviously, I think there was a comment by another member about the pixelation. And as I look at this map, I just want to understand that the yellow, red are areas of concern in the WUI jurisdiction or in the WUI identification that this building code would be applicable to. Is that correct? And as we move forward and we're defining things as locally decided upon by a jurisdiction, what implications does that have to urban growth areas within certain counties or jurisdictions within the WUI code? For instance, I noticed that large portions of Kitsap and Mason County are in WUI code, but I also know that large portions of Kitsap and Mason County are in urban growth areas that are set for quite a bit of development. And if we look at the WUI code and some of the applicable changes or modifications that are being put forth, it will escalate construction pricing in areas where affordable housing is being sought to be provided to unaffordable levels.
Good question. I think there's a couple of things to address there, and I may not have the answers to all of them. Based on the mapping and the pixelation, currently the areas that fall within the WUI code will just be the red and the yellow. If you're a green, you're technically not in the WUI code. You have to make a determination if it will be in the WUI code. And so that's part of what Chapter 3 is, and kind of part of one of the other proposals we have coming up to provide guidance on how to do that. And that's kind of some of the questions that have come from code officials is the areas in green, are they applicable to the Wildland Urban Interface Code? The answer from DNR is no. You have to make that determination at some point. And how you do that needs to be outlined in this code, in our opinion, at least in my opinion. Others may have a different opinion. But again, I think the fire protection plan, just on this section we're on, is part of that component.
Sorry, I'm just looking at the overall picture. I know we're going section by section, but I'm catching up to speed
That's fine.
on this as fast as possible. And again, just want to make sure that I understand what I'm reviewing, because again, as I look at Mason County specific, Belfair, and speaking with the land commissioners over there and understanding what is in the UGA, it looks like a large portion of Belfair's UGA is in the WUI code. And again, that would escalate development and construction costs in that area quite a bit.
And I'll kind of preface it with this. It shouldn't raise any costs currently, because if they are already in a red or yellow, they're required to meet RCW 560, which is the most restrictive ignition resistant construction classification in the current WUI code. So what we're trying to do with this current code modification is to provide some alternative methods to providing the minimum construction requirements that are not the most restrictive. The most restrictive is going to be, if we'll get that in here in a minute in Chapter 5, the most restrictive is going to be the base item, but this will afford you an opportunity to get out of that and make a determination of something else. Because right now you may be in a yellow area, but if you have significant development, maybe that becomes a gray area on the map, which is non-vegetated inhabited, which would not fall within the WUI code. So again, there's this misunderstanding of how the map applies and how you change that map in the future. And that's what we're trying to do with this code to change and clear up, is figuring out how to use this map and how to apply the WUI code.
I appreciate the explanation again. I'm just getting caught up to speed and just want to make sure I understand.
No problem.
What we're reviewing here. So
yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to go over stuff again. So with that, hopefully I answer some of your questions, get you a little up to speed, Joseph. And if it doesn't, we could spend a little more time on that. But is there any additional questions to Chapter 4? I did find something else in one of the appendices on the fire protection plan, and it's under the self-defense mechanism section of that appendix, and it just gives some information. So if folks want to go there and review that as well, and then maybe suggest some modifications to this section 405, that would be great. Or if you decide after reading some of these other sections, you're like, leave it alone, it's fine. That'll be fine too. Just let me know. All right, let's move into Chapter 5. Get into the really good stuff. And I lost my own place. Whoops, come back. I'm working off of 3 screens, by the way. So if I'm looking at all these other places, that's why. Okay. Chapter 5 is really where we get into kind of the meat of what we are doing here, in my opinion. this is where the work group really came in and did some really great work, in my opinion. We had some difference of opinions. We initially started to move away from 560. We came back to the RCW 1927-560. We came back to it and decided, hey, the legislative negotiations went here. Let's kind of keep that. But we wanted to pull the rest of the code in. So what we did in chapter 5 is we changed the scope, which this was an odd one anyway, where the original scope said building structures shall be constructed in accordance with the International Building Code in this code. Well, that was an odd one because it took out the residential code, which most folks are building their houses to. They're not building to the IBC. And so the IBC was not a complete code for residential, and this code was not either. So what we did here is the change to 501.1, where we're talking about general. General is going to point to sections 501.4 through 501.8. Those sections, and a couple of those ones in chapter 4, we talked about the driveways and other stuff, are what is in RCW 1927-560. That's the base of the WUI code for Washington, is what we're proposing, to stick with 560. If you go construct to these standards, which is now listed in 501.4 through 501.8 and other sections, a couple other sections, then you're going to meet the requirements of the RCW and the intent of the WUI code. You don't have to go do anything else. That's what the current legislation is. That's what the current RCW is. If you're identified to be in a WUI code, you go build to RCW 19-560 and you're done. We wanted to keep that. That's your first option here. Your second option that we wanted to expand and bring in more of the Wildland Urban Interface Code is under exception number 1. This is where the rest of the WUI code was left out in the legislation. This says you can go in and you can determine a fire hazard severity level, and in turn determine an ignition resistant construction classification that may not have to meet all the most restrictive requirements that the RCW now adopts. So this is an option. However, of course, it is going to be more time consuming, more costly to some extent, because the applicant can choose to do this, but they're going to have to pay for it on their own. In other words, they're going to have to go do all these assessments that are in section 502 and 503 to make those determinations and document those and provide those to you. And if that means, hey, I want to get somewhere that's not in an interface or a class 1 or something else for ignition resistant, then I have to say do a vegetation reduction management plan. I have to do some other mitigation. That again is going to cost money. Maybe they're going to decide, hey, it's just easier to go with what the original RCW listed and be done. So that's what we've done here. That's really the gist of chapter 5. We're going to stick with RCW 1927-560, which is now sections 501.4 through 501.8 with some modifications. We'll get to those in a minute. And then your option is exception number 1 that says, hey, if you go through the process of 502 and 503 to determine something different, that's what you can construct to. The other 2 exceptions were existing. We just provided some modifications to them. Most everybody in Washington State goes off the residential code and allows up to a 200 square foot accessory structure without permits. So we wanted to align that number with accessory structures in the residential code. And then we just specified some other items on location and made sure that buildings and structures were included, because a structure is not always a building. And that's a different picture. All right. And I have a hand up, Chris.
Would it be possible to, instead of saying accessory structures and given a square footage, say accessory structures exempted from permit by the jurisdiction under chapter 1? Because in our current jurisdiction, we exempt structures up to 400 square feet. in the rural areas and up to 200, well, we're with the 200 square feet in the urban growth areas.
It probably could, however, not to get into the technical parts of that, but if you are allowing a residential structure up to 400 square feet, that modification would need to be approved by the State Building Code Council, because technically that is less restrictive than what is currently adopted. So there's some things there that I don't know if we want to allow jurisdictions to go to that level where they would exceed the limits imposed by the RCWs.
Okay, but that exemption comes out of the administrative chapter. It's not.
It does. So I'm on the fence. I'm not opposed to that. If other folks want to, like I said, I'm giving you my opinion. I'm not opposed to it. I'm not the deciding factor here. The tag is. So if the tag wants to jump on and say, hey, we like that idea, Chris, I'll just give you my opinion first, and then they can jump in and say something.
Just move on. Well, it's okay.
And I'm happy to discuss. Like I said, if other tag members want to agree with that, I think that's, it's not a bad idea.
I think it just opens up a can of worms. I think that we will find a way to deal with it on my end. Thanks.
Okay. And we have a hand up from Steve. Please jump in.
Micah, real quick, it looks like you've stricken 501.2, but so the numbering nomenclature is off. So you go from 501.2, which is stricken, directly to 501.3. So it's just a renumbering exercise. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's probably some of that still left. I apologize. I'm sure we didn't get to all that correlation. So again, like I said, that's kind of part of the, hey, there's Seattle stuff in here, on titles and stuff. I just didn't get all that done.
No worries.
I apologize.
You're missing something or not. So good. Thank you.
I'll throw that on Stoyan to do, and he'll get mad at me. Because I know he doesn't have the staff. I'll help you out with that, Stoyan. Thank you for pointing that out, Steve. Any questions before we move on into these other sections? Because again, this is really the biggest crux of Chapter 5 and tying in RCW 1927-560 and allowing alternatives through adoption of the rest of the code. And I see Mark's hand up. It's nice that you can make it, Mark. Go for it. You're muted.
Hey there, can you hear me all right? I apologize. I arrived late, didn't prepare, and I want to say that I was part of this committee with Micah. He did yeoman's work to get this done. This is this particular section of Chapter 5 is remarkable work, and I'm 100% in support of it. I chair a subcommittee of King County Fire Marshals, and the King County Fire Marshals are very much in support of this. So this is the crux of it, as Mike pointed out. I would only offer that in the deliberations over this, that we considered at great length whether to make exception 1 permissive or mandatory. As it sits in the current form, it's permissive. So essentially the applicant has the ability to impose upon the jurisdiction where the application comes forward to require a review of their professional engineering work that proves their case, that they're in some different classifications under the other requirements of the WUI code. And I and my group have felt that while something that probably would work for our jurisdiction could be burdensome for smaller jurisdictions that aren't necessarily prepared to review that kind of work, don't have the expertise, would have to third party it. It's certainly possible to do, but ultimately we would have been in favor of language leading up to exception 1 that says we're approved by the code official to make that at the discretion of the local jurisdiction. Other than that, super good work. I'm really proud of this group. We came together and explored in depth, and I'm very grateful to Micah for his leadership in this group. So thank you, Micah. And that's the only thing that I would say about all of this work was that. So appreciate it, and I'll yield.
Thank you very much, Mark. You were a big part of this too, so I appreciate the words of compliment there, and I appreciate your participation. I know that was something we debated highly on, was whether or not to be permissive or have to get approval for the code official, and I think this is where the overall group landed, especially based on the fact that jurisdictions can impose fees for this work, and so if there is additional costs, those could be covered. Again, that's where that the choice of the applicant can come in and say, hey, it will be easier and cheaper for me just to go ahead and do what was part of the original RCW and move on. But thanks for making that point, Mark, and thanks for being a participant in developing this. So, and I'll open the floor to discuss Mark's point on that, and to the tag, please, if there's any additional thoughts on that. All right, then we will move on into the other sections. So based on that renumbering comment, we did strike 501.2 as the objective. That's kind of in the administrative part of this, the purpose and objective. There's no reason to repeat it. Again, this is just to clarify it's not necessary, so we struck that language. Moving on into 501.3, again, this is existing language that we didn't feel needed to be modified. This provides standards and listings and where to go find that information, or a prescriptive design out of the IBC for fire resistance rated construction. That's where you'll find it. You're not going to find it in the IRC necessarily. So we wanted to leave that section. And then getting into 501.4, and if my numbers are off, again, we'll clear that up, Sean, thanks. So I'm just going to stick with what's on the screen. What we did here is we felt it was easier to strike the original roof covering language and bring in this stuff from the RCW. So again, this is language straight from the RCW 501.4, I guess it'll be the number, 501.4 under roof covering. And this is, hey, if you are in the WUI code and you don't want to do the whole 502, 503 assessment, this is what you have to install. Pretty much it's going to come down to, you got to put in Class A roofing. That's it. I'm going to simplify that section. We can move on to the next one unless there's questions. Sweet. Moving on. Moving on to 501.5, we'll go to exterior walls. Again, we struck some of the roof covering language that was already there, brought over RCW 560, and that's where we ended up. Exterior walls are projections other than decks. So this is where we're going to break a little bit from the RCW, but we're still going to require the same thing. So in other words, in this section, we broke out decks and appendages because let's just go through 501.5 and let me explain that. So that was Class 1 ignition resistant construction requirements. That is straight language from the RCW. What we did is we brought out the decks because, again, I worked in California as well, and they kind of had what they call a modified heavy timber. So if you see item number 3 and 501.5, number 3, and 501.6, number 5, pretty much those lists align. But for decks, we didn't want you to have to go for the heavy timber requirement. So if you go up in the code previously, it talks about where to find heavy timber. Heavy timber points you to the building code, the IBC. So heavy timber, say if you've got a post for a deck, under the heavy timber requirements of the building code, that would be a minimum 8x8 deck post if you're in the WUI code. So that's just, it's overkill. Everybody knows that. So is why we pulled the decks out, and this was a recommendation for me coming from California. We modified the heavy timber portion for decks. Pretty much everything else is the same. You can use fire retardant treated wood. You can use ignition resistant materials of whatever, non-combustible. But under the heavy timber portion, we wanted to allow some smaller stuff to go in there instead of the defined stuff or outline stuff in the IBC. So if you'll scroll down just a little bit to 501.6, that's what this section does. It's almost identical to the exterior wall section above, which is out of 560, but it does allow an alternative when you are using heavy timber. And again, heavy timber is a choice for your decking material. It's not a requirement. So if you do use it for your deck, we don't want you to have to go to the IBC for these extra large heavy timber material. We want you to have an alternative. And that's what this alternative or this list does. That is really the main difference between 501.5 and 501.6. The other additional item talks about the screening below the decks less than 48 inches. That's to prevent, your accumulation of leaves and debris and other stuff. I want to say that's required in another portion of the WUI code under class 1 ignition resistant. I don't remember all of it verbatim, but I'm pretty sure that's in there. It might not be worded the same, but it's very similar. That's the two differences there. Hopefully that's something that folks want to discuss or say, no, we don't want to go that route. We want to send them back to the IBC for heavy timber. But that's the reason we pulled out I recommended we pull out the decks from the exterior wall standard. Any questions or thoughts on that? Okay, we'll scroll down to the strike through underneath that. Again, this is where we kind of combine the decks and appendages language, because a lot of the ignition resistant, especially class 1 and class 2, a lot of the language is redundant. You'll see that as we get further down into those specific ones. But again, we're still in the sections that cover RCW 1927-560. So then we get to two additional items. So these were added kind of an additional, it's not 560, but some of us felt that these were important. I know for myself, the exterior glazing was a big part of the wildland urban interface code changes that they did in California after they had the large fire down near San Diego. I want to say in like 2002. And then the vents were another addition that weren't in the 560 language that the fire folks felt was important as well, to limit or provide guidance on the attic ventilation as part of the standard requirements without going through the options below. And I have a hand up from Steve.
Mike, I'm happy to hear that your experience in California with this section of the code is an inclusion into this. What we've done, in fact, there's several or a few of us, Grant Muller and John Weisman, who are on the phone. All of us together sort of put together what you're seeing on the screen now. And I'll just give you a little bit of background on that. The 501.7 as it exists right now gives all of the information that I've included in this code change proposal. However, it's caused us a lot of heartburn, both with building officials, with the manufacturers, with the customers, not really knowing what any of that means. So I've simply taken the section 708A out of the California code and put it into these bullet points, so it's fairly easy to read. The only thing that's in addition to that is this new definition. I apologize, it should have been just 202 rather than R202. And that comes from the California Energy Code, so that we understand what a glazed door is. That seems to be, of all things, a real bugaboo with some building officials understanding what that means. So within this, what I'm suggesting, or what I would like to propose, is simply a strike through 501.7 and a replacement with the language that I've got here. That clarifies all of the requirements for exterior glazing, which includes, of course, windows, doors, skylights, glazed openings in exterior doors, glazed openings in exterior garage doors. The intent also is have a fire protection rating of not less than 20 minutes based on what standard. So we've included a standard in there for the fire protection rating, which is different, by the way. The testing is different for windows and for doors. Let's see, what else have we got in there?
Is there more of the code change? Sorry to interrupt you. Is there more than just what I'm seeing on the screen stops at 5. Okay, there is.
Oh,
Thank
no,
you.
no, I'm sorry. It covers all the way through. Plus I've got a reasoning statement in it. And really the bottom line is the code change proposal does not add any cost to construction. In fact, I would offer that it might reduce the cost because it simply clarifies what the needs are.
Do we lose me? Do we lose Steve?
No, I'm still there, just letting people sort of absorb all of this, and I'm certainly here to answer any questions. And my colleague Grant Muller, and if John wants to weigh in, that's up to him as well. But we've all worked pretty closely together with the California State Fire Marshal's office, among others.
I was trying to raise my hand and I can't figure out how to do that. But anyway, this is Grant Muller. The one thing that has also been added, if you look at the original code language, it talks about multi-layered glazing and it basically or tempered glass and or glass block and the like. Well, what Steve has done in the language here, per the California code, it's very specific that that windows, the way it was originally written, you could interpret it that you simply put an insulating glass unit in a window, and that meets the WUI code. And that's not what we found with the testing that was done. Micah, I think you would recognize that as well. Tempered glass is a key component in adding thermal stress resistance and strength to the window. So what Steve's proposed here becomes very specific about that, the use of tempered glass.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks, Steve. I see Guy, your hand is up, and if any others wanted to weigh in on this, it'd be great.
Actually, I'm not on glass. I'm back on the screening. I had a question on that 1/4" screening. I guess from the training I took through NFPA, they recommend 8" screening. That 1/4", where did that? I guess there's a disconnect from what we tell everyone, what I just saw in the code. Comments? This is my first code meeting, so I'm new to this group too.
So you're on venting. So what we'll do, guys, we'll come back to the venting since we did have an alternate language proposal on the glazing. We'll knock that out first since that's kind of going in order. But good question. So hold on to those and we'll come back to them. And then I see Erica, was your hand up on the glazing or the venting?
The venting.
Okay. All right. So I do have some questions for the glazing folks. And sorry if I'm not in my right section just yet. Have you all proposed this to the national code language? Because we are just pulling this, and if you have, where's that landed? Because we are just pulling the glazing language from 504, the current 504 under class 1 ignition resistant requirements up into what we consider would have been the RCW language 560. So that's my question first. And I see Chip, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and I can wait, but I would like to go back to the decking section when we can.
Okay.
So, Mike, if I could weigh in on the whether this has been proposed, I will admit that I missed the deadline to get this in, and I sort of think that after the last 20 years or so of code development hearings, my experience with the Washington group is you're awfully proactive in bringing things forward and having some success on the hearing floor. So I thought this might be an awfully good place because I missed the the timeline. If we can start with Washington in driving this forward to the next code change cycle of 2027. Good Lord, maybe I'll be retired by then. Frankly, I'm surprised that the California folks haven't brought this forward because it's been in the code. We worked on this back in 2000. Oh gosh, I want to say 7, 8, somewhere in there. And it went into the California code in 2010. So this has been a long time coming. And frankly, what's in the 2000 or what was put into the California code has not changed in those 12 years. So it's pretty solid, at least in their mind, and they're probably as fire averse as any of us here on the West Coast. So my apologies. It has not been approached in a more of a nationwide method.
Okay. Thanks for that input. John, is yours on? Excuse me, glazing.
Yes, please, real quickly.
Sure. Yeah.
Steve, thanks for the comments. It's been a couple of years since I've been involved with the glazing stuff, but since you mentioned it was, this was worked on back in 2007, 2010 or so. Yes, I was involved with it back then. And Steve's right. We collaborated to provide good explanatory requirements in California, and I also have somewhat ignored them for several years because there's been no controversy about them. And then following up just a little bit with Chip's comment earlier, I didn't know whether there'd be discussion of details or not, and I too would like to talk about the deck language too when it's appropriate. So I was silent earlier because I wasn't sure whether it was appropriate or not. So thank you.
Okay, thanks for jumping in. I am open to some of this language. For me, again, this is for the tag to discuss. So if tag members can jump in and maybe process or analyze this, and if they need to have Annette or Stoyan scroll through it again, please feel free. Again, I'm just presenting what we have, and so Steve, if you want to present this a little more to the tag and have them discuss it, that's great. I will.
I'm happy to. Yeah, Mike, I'm happy to go through it section by section. If that helps, if you've got the time on your agenda today, I welcome the opportunity. It was sent out, I believe Stoyan sent this out with the agenda either last night or this morning, I don't recall. And frankly, it's awfully short notice for anybody to have gone through and sort of digested all of this. So if we look at what's in the language right now, 501.7, to Grant's point earlier, the confusion with tempered glass, multi-layered glass, which is it just tempered glass? Is it tempered multi-glazed panels, or what is it that we're looking for? So we've cleared that up by adding in to 501.7.1 the type of glazing, and again, based on some of the testing that was done in UC Berkeley back in 2000, early 2000s, I don't remember the exact year. It was determined that the tempered one tempered pane in an IG unit, insulating glass unit, would nearly double the time that it took for the fire to breach the opening. So that's why the recommendation that came out of there, in fact, I think it's still a recommendation that comes out of the Insurance Institute for Building and Home Safety and some of their testing down there. And that is sort of conducted under the guidance of Steve Quarles, who did the testing at UC Berkeley. So this bullet point 1 under 501.7.1 sort of clears up what is really required in that multi-pane glazing. Energy code requires, generally speaking, at least an insulating glass unit. And in this case, all we're doing is suggesting that one tempered pane be included. I would say that if the code did not clear this up, you might put 2 layers of tempered glass in, and then again, to meet the energy code, you're going to have to use a low-E coated glass, and that gets really, really expensive when you start to temper that. It probably nearly triples the price of a tempered pane. Maybe, Grant, I don't remember what the number was, but it's quite high. So that I believe cleared up what was required under Windows, other than the other piece is to at least clarify what a fire resistance rating is, and that's in accordance with NFPA 257. So if we move down then to structural glass veneer, it just basically says it should comply with, oh my gosh, I didn't change the number. That should be, I had this prepared because I'm taking it to Salem tomorrow. So I've used their language. That should actually be 501.7.1, not R32725, my error.
Yeah, what number did you say, 501?
Yes, it should be 501.7.1. And you can take the R out from the front of that as well. That shouldn't be there. My apologies. Anyhow, basically, it's just suggesting that any glass veneer must comply with the same testing requirements or be of tempered glass or glass block units. So it just clears that up. And again, this is language that's been largely taken from the California Building Code 708A. We go down to 501.7.3, which is exterior doors, and now we get a little bit more prescriptive in there. So with exterior doors, generally there's going to be a surface cladding or a skin or something in there. It needs to be non-combustible or ignition resistant material, or if it's solid wood, or have the fire resistance rating of not less than 20 minutes when tested in accordance to NFPA 252, which is the door test standard. 257 is the window and glass test standard. 252 is a door test standard. So we want to make sure that if we're going to have to provide a fire resistance rating, it must be to one or the other of those standards. Then we get down into, again, that somewhat prescriptive language. As a solid core wood door, must comply with the requirements of stiles and rails, not less than 1 3/8 inches thick, and then the raised panels not less than 1.25 inches thick, with the perimeter tongue taper to not less than 3/8 of an inch. This is very consistent with what's been in the California code. I hate to keep referring to the California code. It's the only model I've got. This is consistent with the code that's been there for, like I say, a dozen years. The other thing that seems to vex an awful lot of people is exterior door glazing. If you look at the 501.7 as it exists today, it is a little bit confusing. Where what's a glazed door? Well, we define a glazed door in the definition that I've added in. So when you have exterior door glazing, whether it's a small 12 by 12 light or a full light, in either case, it has to comply with, oh my gosh, once again, I missed that. It should be section 501.7.1. Good heavens, I thought I cleaned all that up. So basically, the glass must be compliant with what's in the window section. And then, of course, we've added in the 2 new reference standards to be consistent with the language that we've added in. I also have down at the bottom some reasoning statement, but I think I've defined the reasons for all of this, if that helps.
It does. I appreciate you going through that. I do want to let the tag have some time to discuss this. I guess I have a couple of questions right out of the gate for these items. Technically, from what we're pulling over from ignition resistant classification 1 to align with RCW 1927-560, we did not bring over any information on exterior doors, just glazing. So if the tag wants to include this as kind of part of the prescriptive, just go do this and you don't have to do anything else, measure, that would be another item that we may want to discuss further, on whether or not we want to include exterior doors in that or just stick with the glazing. The other part of that too is we don't have to have glazing in this section. We can just keep the glazing under the ignition resistant classification 1 and 2, and then maybe modify it with Steve's proposed modifications there. So there are some options I want to make sure the tag is aware of, kind of moving forward. So that's my 2 cents, and then let the tag jump in.
Well, I think that's a fair way to start this, and certainly we're here to answer any questions if we can.
Okay.
I would add, Micah, that adding in exterior doors, our goal is to try to protect the the structure, and certainly doors are not probably as problematic as windows are, but even so, fire breaches where fire breaches, and
Sure.
wherever we can cover that. I would also add that generally speaking, most exterior doors are either built this way. In fact, a lot of wood doors are going to be a minimum of an inch and 3/4 thick rather than an inch and 3/8. So they're probably going to exceed that, and that's just my experience as a door manufacturer.
Sure.
And then of course the cladding being non-combustible.
Right.
You know, so this is not putting a burden really on any of the fenestration manufacturers. It's just
Sure.
clarifying what's going to be required.
No, I can agree with you there. Like I said, for me personally, I'm not opposed to that change. However, for the stuff that we're pulling from the RCW, the legislative language,
Sure.
exterior doors was not included. However, exterior doors are included in ignition construction classification 1 and 2 down below. So if the tag does want to adopt or look at these changes, maybe they do look at that under section 504 and not in section 501 is all I was getting at.
Sure.
We didn't, our intent was not to pull in exterior doors and all the other stuff from ignition classification 1 into kind of the base items that were part of the legislative package originally. So that's kind of what I was going with. And Dave, you have your hand up here.
Yeah, I just wanted to get that clarification in there that so what's in 501.7 is directly imported from the RCW. I guess so yeah, I would be more conducive to addressing the glazing indoors in the ignition resistant requirements.
Okay. I was going to say, let me ask you before you go on, Dave, I do want to clarify something for you. The 501.7 exterior glazing is not part of RCW 1927-560.
Okay.
That was a discussion point from the work group. I was the one that proposed that as being kind of part of the base requirements. I'm going to call them base requirements as part of that 560 package, but taking one or two little steps further, which is the glazing and the venting. So they were not originally part of 560. However, the work group felt that these two items could be important enough to include in that. If you don't do anything else, you don't go through the steps of 502 and 503 to determine something different, then we would be addressing glazing and venting as a state kind of base code requirement language. So I just want to specify that before you go on. Thanks, Dave. Sorry,
that's
didn't mean
good
to.
clarification. No, I guess the only added thought was that at least with fenestration and or glazing indoors, I mean, will at least be tempered in most cases. So I don't know if that alleviates any concerns.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, Dave, that federal law requires that glazing indoors be tempered or safety glazing, have a safety glazing rating on it. But even with that, where there are exterior doors and where they may not have glazing, there at least needs to be some level of design included, whether it's either by test or certain prescriptive requirements, which again are very, very common in the door industry.
All right, thank you.
Dave?
I appreciate the discussion, and I think that that's what the purpose of the tag is, to take a look at the language that's there, which is what's being proposed with this. And this is actually kind of going ahead as we're getting some proposal a little bit early before we start going through some of this. But I do think we want to look at these proposals thoroughly to see if it does have some good applicability moving forward. So I do support. Let's take some time to look at this.
Thank you. Thanks for the input on this, Steve. So this is another option for folks to keep in the back of their minds in 5017. But if we can go back, we'll start discussing the vents. Thanks, Steve. I don't know if there's any, and maybe Tony, you can verify, is there an action need to be taken on Steve's proposal right now, or are we just under consideration for future recommendation, I guess, as an option to move forward?
I think it'd be best to run as a consideration today. And then if action council or tag action needs to be taken at the next meeting, or that would probably be best.
Okay.
Yeah, good. I appreciate that. Going back to a comment that Tony made earlier, the code is written for everyone. In this case, our customers are going to be the building official, the manufacturers, and the permit holders. So they all have to understand what's required of them. So this is why we developed this language to hopefully help out all of those customers, if you will. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody, for that additional discussion. All right, if we can go back to the entire code proposal, will be under section 501.7 and 501.8. There we go. So let's move into the vent discussion again. I do want to clarify, because Dave made that good point, I'm going to say it again. 501.7 and 501.8 were not part of the original RCW, but these were items that the work group felt were important enough that if we're going to have just a standard, go do this, you don't have to look at anything else. No other assessments are necessary. If you're in the WUI code, just build it this way. We felt those were important inclusions. Again, these could be removed by the tag if necessary or further modified as per Steve's proposal or someone else's proposal. John, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Yeah, just real quickly on vents. I remember some debate discussion in the California WUI discussion with the state fire marshal's office there. But my understanding, and this is just a suggestion, and that is there's a new ASTM standard for ember and flame resistance of vents, and perhaps some language could be added or not, but it could be if a product event complies with an ASTM standard, that might be a reasonable item 2, for example, or a revision in 501.8, because I think that new standard E2886 was developed explicitly for WUI applications for vents.
Okay. Was that included as a reference standard in the 2021 I code?
No, I don't believe so. I think it's even newer than that.
Okay. So I guess that would be a determination Stewing would have to make if we could adopt that reference standard if it hasn't been vetted at the national level. I don't have that answer, John.
Okay. Yeah. So just a suggestion for consideration. That's all.
Okay. All right. And just for everyone's information, 501.8 was it's base code language in 504. All we did, again, the work group felt it was important to include as part of that kind of standard code language without having to go through the process. And so that's why it's included here. I think Guy brought up the 1/4 inch opening. We didn't change that. We haven't modified that from the base code language. This is really just a relocation. We just have to show it as or actually it's a copy, not a relocation. The vent language is still in 504, but we just have to show it as an underline as part of how we're showing a new section under 501. So again, this was just base code language that we did not modify technically. Steve.
Through the chair, if I may ask John Weisman this question. John, I thought that was that addition of the ASTM standard was approved at the hearings. The fire code for the 2024 code. Do you recall that?
This is way outside of my area of expertise, but that could very well have happened, Steve. I can go back and look, but I'd
have to look too.
I will say that you're correct, Steve, and that it was adopted for the 2024. And that's my question to Stoyan. We're only operating under the 2021. And the question would be, could we do an advance adoption of that reference standard? If it's obviously, if it was adopted by ICC, that means it was published and ready to go for 2024. And that's just a question we'd have to verify. It's not that I don't want to, it's just if it's not ready for 2021, then the question would be, can we actually adopt it?
Yeah.
In general, yes, we can, because 2/3 of our proposals are from 2024. It's not that I like this fact, but this is what we do. Again, the answer is yes, we can. It depends, if the TAC and BFP committee and the council will approve that.
Okay. Excellent. So John or Steve, if one of you can maybe send that reference standard number again to Stoyan with some additional information so we can in the future determine whether or not we want to include that, please. maybe Tony could say that. I'm not the tag chair. I mean, I do enough chair of other meetings, so stepping on Tony's toes there.
I would recommend to, again, bring something as a proposal to take tag action on the next meeting. I think letting this stuff marinate after this meeting is a good idea before we do any tag action. So
okay, thanks, Tony. And there were some other hands up on the venting. Now that we're to that section, did folks want to provide some additional information there? I know Guy kind of mentioned it, and then Chip, I think you had your hand up. And if I'm missing someone else, I apologize.
Yeah, this is Guy. My only question is just trying to see why the difference was from what I'm getting from NFPA on 1/8" screening on vents versus 1/4". I do like that addition of going to whatever that code is, because you don't necessarily have to screen a vent to be fireproof. There's other ways. But that was just a confusion when you're in the field, we're saying one thing, and the code says something less restrictive. So that sometimes gives confusion to the educators out there.
Good point. I don't have an answer. I'm just sticking with base code language. I don't have an answer. I just went with base code. So if somebody else has it, great. Erica, go ahead.
I know Stephen Quarles did a study that said 1/4" screen does poor performance, whereas 1/8" screen has the best performance.
Okay. And I guess my question would be are there materials available with that 1/8" screening per the requirements of vents in 501.8 or other sections of venting for WUI?
This is Guy. I think so. Well, I didn't take my tape measure, but I just replaced my vents, and they look to make 1/8" vent screening when I replaced all my vents. But I didn't take my tape measure out.
Okay. Just a curiosity question. And I think Chip, you had your hand up too, and I want to make sure I don't skip you in any way.
Again, my comments, I wanted to direct back towards the decking section.
Perfect.
If we could do that now, that's fine.
Absolutely.
Or if
Let's
you
go
wanted
back up. I have no problem with that. So if
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no
So
problem.
I'm new to the group, and listening to a lot of the discussion so far, there's been a lot of conversation about references to what was done in California. My background, I work for AZAC Building Products. We're an exterior building products manufacturer. And my interest here is concerning decks. We are currently accepted in California as an alternative decking material under the current SFM test standards. And I guess my first question was there any consideration in writing this language of alternative decking materials?
I think that is covered under 501.6 number 4. Any material that complies with the minimum performance standard performance requirements of 503.2. So I think that, and of course that reference number is probably incorrect, but I think that covers what you're indicating or asking, Chip, is can there be alternate materials as long as it meets the performance standard? That answer is yes.
Yeah,
so if you're
I have to
accepted as under performance, go ahead.
Yeah, I have to apologize because I'm driving.
No problem.
Through a rainstorm, no less. But does that limit it to ignition resistant materials as the language is written?
I don't. Let's scroll up to that section, and others can interpret that question a little bit too. Would you mind scrolling up on the screen to 501.6? So you're asking if item number 4 of that section, any material that complies with minimum performance requirements of 503.2 and attached exterior wall covering is also either non-combustible or ignition resistant material. I don't think that limits it, would be my answer. John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, John Weisman here. On behalf of the Composite Lumber Manufacturers Association, there's a number of things to potentially talk about here in 501.6 in conjunction also with 503.2. You're just looking at, well, is it okay to take just a couple of minutes?
Sure, let's try to answer Chip's concern. And that way, because this is what we're here for, to discuss the technical merits.
Yeah. Chip, go ahead, Chip. But sorry.
I'll defer to John. We've worked together over a number of years on this. And further background to me, I was involved in discussions with the California SFM all the way back into 2005, and a lot of work with ski corals, and a lot of our preliminary work was done out of the Western Fire Center out of Kelso. And that's how we were able to prove out that there are alternatives to the ignition resistant material defined items that have been very successful used in California. With that, I'll defer over to John at the moment. Thank you.
So regarding decks and decking materials, the IWUI code is significantly different than the California building code requirements, or WUI code requirements, chapter 7A. Very significant differences. And we know that the California requirements have been enforced significantly and broadly within California. On the other hand, the IWUI requirements have been relatively sporadically, not in very many markets have the IWUI requirements been enforced. So the challenges with the language in 503.2, because that's related here to 501.6, that language really needs some significant scrutiny, especially regarding decking products. And we've attempted to make some changes within the the IWUI code on behalf of CLMA, but honestly haven't been successful with many changes or some of the changes we were successful, or we were helpful in success in making a change for the 2024 that we can get to later on weathering and evaluation of weathering. But there's a couple aspects in 503.2, the ignition resistant requirements, that are pretty onerous. The requirements there in conjunction with 501.6 as proposed would be pretty restrictive for decking products, maybe appropriately, maybe not. But as written, from what I can see, the language would pretty much exclude the use of composite decking material as written, these proposed requirements. So okay. I'll stop there for a minute. Yeah,
and I would add that even within California, there are some variations in the adoptive language. At the state level, you can comply to what's known as an underdeck test. San Diego County required a little further.
Is that me that lost Chip, or
testing 108 roofing test?
Okay.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it might have been my side. It sounded like you broke up a little bit. I'm not sure if that was for everybody or not. Might have just
I just dipped into a valley. My apologies. But anyway, even within California, different levels of adoption. My point is, San Diego County added some additional requirements to the testing that's not enforced at the state level for alternative products. But even within San Diego, there are products that can meet those test standards and have performed well over the years. And as I look at modifications that were made for heavy timber construction, we had long discussions with the state fire marshal's office down there in terms of consumer choice. Ultimately, yes, the protection of the environment and home and the damage from wildfires is a true concern. But we've got proven products in the market down there that have been accepted for over 10 years at this point.
Sure. All right, Chip. I appreciate the input. Same with John, and I got Dave's hand up, and I think we'll kind of have a short discussion on this further, and then we'll move on to other sections. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you.
Actually, my suggestion is, it sounds like there's some validity for some modifications to this proposal, and I recommend that the modifications be submitted for our next meeting.
I was about to say the same. I think that's a good recommendation, Dave. I do think there's some opportunity here. I do interpret a little different, Chip. I think that number 4 allows that performance compliance, even if it's a little erroneous in the charging language or base language of 503. Again, we're not modifying 503 necessarily. It's just base code language. And so if there's some modifications you want to make there, coming from California, I agree with you. There were some products that we allowed or didn't allow. I know some of the extruded plastics never was allowed. However, some of the stuff like the solid Trex, you know, the solid materials were allowed. So I think it did come down to, you could fall under chapter 1 under alternative means and methods. And number 4 there does say, if as long as it complies with the performance requirements there, that you will meet that standard and it should be allowed. That may come down to an interpretation issue, but we look forward to some of your proposed changes in either this section of chapter 5. Of course, that would have to carry through 501, 504, 505, 506, at least 504, 505. And then also in section 503 for those standards. Again, a lot of that we're not modifying. It's just standard language. The deck portion here, again, if you look at the exterior wall language above, it's almost exact verbatim language. The majority of the change is just that heavy timber allowance. So we look forward to some of those changes for the next meeting. I will move on to further sections now, if that's okay with the group.
That's fine, and thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think that gets us through kind of the base. When I say the base, something that more or less aligns with RCW 1927-560, and then we get into section 502. If there's more questions on some of these items for kind of meeting 560, you know, save that for the next meeting. Maybe send in some written proposals or written language or changes, and that'd be very helpful. Moving on to 502, what we really changed here under fire hazard severity, again, we're going to take some of the appendices that kind of talk about a you know, mitigation plans and other items and other stuff that we want to make sure that are not piecemealed adoption by jurisdiction. They are adopted specifically within the WUI code as chapters for Washington State. So that's really where the changes are made here. I don't have a recollection, and maybe if Mark is still on them, why we changed footnote B or added footnote B to table 502. I know that's kind of crazy. Actually, it's in there already. I'm not sure why it's red. Never mind, don't listen to me. That's in the base code. Maybe it's just something I formatted. So sorry. I see it as underlined in red. I'm not sure if everybody else sees it. Yeah, they do. Looking at 2 different screens. So never mind, ignore me. I think that's all we changed in 502. Any questions there? All right. 503, again, I mentioned this earlier, we didn't modify 503. That's standard base code, WUI language. We haven't modified it at all. Moving on to 504. Again, 502 and 503 are those areas where that exception in 501 comes into play. If you follow the process in 502 and 503, meeting those requirements, you can, you know, do your findings of fact. You can determine your fire hazard severity and your ignition resistant construction if you choose to. Let me make sure we mute Chip there. Again, that's if the applicant chooses to not just do what pretty much came out of 560. So that's why we didn't change 502, 503. Getting further down into 504, again, we didn't modify much of 504, except where we were trying to align 504 with what we did up in 501. In other words, we modified the appendages and projections section here and modified or added the deck language. So we scroll down, I'm sorry, I'm 504.7 and 504.8. Next page, that's how quick I went through that, sorry. So here we are again. This, like I said, this is similar to how we modified 501 from RCW 560. Again, we're just adding these or taking these decks out, keeping the majority of the same language, but adding this optional heavy timber design or use instead of going over to the building code. As I mentioned before, section 504 is ignition resistant classification 1, and that is the majority of what 560 is as well. However, there's some additional items in here that we did pull over. Again, I mentioned the exterior glazing and the vents, but then there's some other information under here that is not pulled up into 501. So if you go through the whole process and you determine if you're a fire ignition resistant classification 1, the question came up was, well, do I have to meet that, or can I just meet the requirements of the base, what I call the base code RCW 560? My intention was to allow them to meet the base 560 language, because technically the ignition classification 1 is more restrictive and has you do more work than if you just meet the base stuff for Washington and was part of the legislative package. Does that make sense at all? Hopefully it does. I'm not hearing any not know, but hell no. I did see one head shake in there. I think Steve's the only one with video on, at least ones that I could see at the moment. Okay. Oh, there's other people on video. Sure, I got a thumbs up. Thank you, Rich. Now I'm seeing other people. I have too many screens
That
open.
again? I'd like you to explain that again for me.
Okay. So if we could scroll down just a little bit, Stoyan, to 5049, 50410. So again, if you go through the process, so say you don't want to go through 501.1 that says just install this if you're in the WUI code. In other words, just install RCW 1927-560. If you don't want to do that and you want to go through the exception process, exception number 1 that says if you determine you're in a different fire hazard severity or ignition resistant construction classification, then go build what's in that ignition resistant construction classification. Ignition resistant classification 1 per 504 is more restrictive than what is in 560. So if you go through the process and you determine you're in ignition resistant classification 1, but the applicant goes, hey, I don't want to do these extra items. Can I just go back and meet the requirements of 501? The intent for that would be to say yes. Does that answer your question, Chris? Is that okay? I see a thumbs up in your video there. Perfect. All right. So with that, we're going to move on down. That is what we covered or modified in 504. We're going to go into 505, which is ignition resistant construction class 2. Again, it's like I said before, there's a lot of redundant language in class 1 and class 2. So is what we did again in class 2 covers the decks again verbatim for class 1. So all we did was make those same changes we made in ignition resistant classification 1 into ignition resistant classification 2. In other words, we're allowing you or providing you some more options. All right, scrolling through. Now we get into 506, ignition resistant classification 3. Didn't make any changes here. So if you want to, again, hold on, don't go, I'm going to explain my whole chapter 501 again. 501 exception, if you want to go through the process to determine your fire hazard severity, ignition resistant classification, you come out as a class 3. All you have to do to meet a class 3 is what's on this page. You see it right here. Much less compared to a class 1, class 2, or even the requirements of 1927-560. So this is where it may benefit a lot of applicants to come in and go, I'm going to do all these things, whether it's a vegetation reduction, other mitigation measures, and I'm going to get to a class 3 because maybe they've determined that the cost of meeting either the base 560 language or a class 1 ignition or class 2 ignition resistant is so expensive, then they want to meet this class 3 and they get there, they don't have to do a whole lot. You're not going to get into their exterior envelope, their exterior wall construction, decks, or anything else like that. So that's where the benefits of allowing this option of exception number 1 in 501.1 to occur is when you get into really some of class 2 and then really in class 3. Any questions on that? Okay. And then here we didn't want to allow something different than what is kind of the base RCW language. So we're pointing, if you're re-roofing, we're pointing you back to that 501.4. In other words, we want all our re-roofs in the WUI area to be a class A, more or less is what that says. Unless somebody wants to go through that whole process of determining something different from 502 and 503. And that's what that says for there. You can go through the 501.1 exception process to determine something different. Most people aren't going to do that, but we didn't want to take away that option. All right. That wraps up chapter 5. I know we're going to try to get through this. I know we're getting short on time. We got 2 other things to discuss today. Hopefully we'll wrap it up real quick here. Chapter 6. Let's scroll up just a little more to automatic sprinklers. 602 right there. This is the change to chapter 6. And maybe some of the fire folks can get on here and explain why we did this. The reason we are striking the requirements of the sprinklers, we did listen. I know if Andrea from BIEW is still on here. Andrea mentioned early on that they would really not support this if we required the ignition resistant construction and the sprinklers in this code from the state. So we said, okay, we can understand that, especially given that there is already a path for individual jurisdictions to require sprinklers without having to go back through the State Building Code Council. So we felt that that was an adequate change for the WUI code. We're not going to require or mandate that if you're in the WUI code, you have to put sprinklers. We are still going to leave that up to the individual jurisdiction as already allowed by state law. Any questions on that change?
Just wanted to say thank you, Micah.
You're welcome. Sorry, I'm coughing, so I'm muted. Absolutely. We want to listen. We want to make sure that we're listening to stakeholders on this and trying to combine that information with what the legislators want and what all the stakeholders want. So I think it's I'm for this change. Again, there's already a path for jurisdictions to require sprinklers no matter what. No reason to mandate it here. All right. That sums up the change for chapter 6. Then is what we did we can just do this real fast. You probably don't have to scroll through it. In the reference standards, we're going to change, it's technically chapter 7. We're going to change that to chapter 10. So you can, if you want to scroll down and make people seasick, excuse me, we are leaving Appendix A as an appendix. Oh, where did I get to? Appendix B is the vegetation management appendix, which we're going to make chapter 7. So that way it gets adopted into the code because it is referenced in the body of the code that we want to adopt and allow. And then we get into, again, Appendix C, same reason we're making that chapter 8. And then we are Appendix D for the fire danger rating system that has fuel modeling and all the fuel modeling information that aligns with the definitions in the WUI code. And as part of the 502 and 503 package, we're moving that into chapter 9. And then the rest of the appendices will remain appendices. So again, we're trying to make this a pretty balanced and comprehensive, I don't like to use that word, a pretty balanced code that covers everything. And that way jurisdictions don't have to go in and individually adopt appendices or say it's not part of the code or make some other argument there. We're including it as a package. Dave, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Micah. I just have a couple questions as a newbie to this. Chapter 6, fire protection requirements. Can you address if these requirements were kind of carte blanche from the RCW and how this relates to, it does say new and existing buildings and has some maintenance provisions in it. Just want a clarification that the scope of these requirements covers residences or properties that were improved under this code when this code becomes effective, or is it to address anything that pops up within a map, yellow or red, when it comes to defensible space, firewood storage?
So you're talking about as enforcement on existing structures.
Right.
Okay.
Just a clarification, yeah.
So that was part of chapter 1 where we talked about the unmitigated safety item as determined by the code official.
Gotcha.
So that is covered under retroactivity under that section.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could apply if the code official comes in and finds something that's egregious and say the applicant doesn't want to mitigate it, or there's no mitigation measure
Yeah.
that could occur with coordination with your code official, then yes, this defensible space, these items in the WUI code could then apply retroactively based on the language in chapter 1.
Otherwise, it applies to new installations constructed under this code and
Correct.
then shall be maintained in accordance with this code if constructed under this code.
Correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
And if others have other answers to that, please chime in. That's, again, I'm sure my opinion. So other opinions are very welcome. All right. That actually sums up what we did to the entire WUI code right there. We do have 2 other proposals that we can come that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. And I don't know, Tony, if we want to talk about those before we take action on this, considering they pertain to chapter 3. So if Stoyan or Annette, who's ever controlling the screen, wants to go back up to chapter 3, we can kind of explain where these next 2 proposals come in, and then maybe take an action, or maybe no. Tony actually said no action today. We're just throwing this out there.
How I'm envisioning this, and this could be if other members have another way of looking at this from an efficiency standpoint, is that being that it's 3:20 now, I'd like to make sure that we get through all of them. And that way everyone gets to hear what's on the table. And then with what time we have left, if any, or between now and the next one, then maybe the first agenda item on the next meeting is proposed changes to what was presented at the previous WUI tag. That's how I'd like to see it done. I think that's efficient. Let me know your thoughts.
I think that sounds great.
Okay. All right. With that, Micah, keep on going, man.
with that, talk faster. All right, I can do that.
Micah, just for the record, I'm your administrative assistant today.
Thanks, Stoyan. I really appreciate that. Which one are you on, Stoyan? I apologize. Can you scroll up? Is this the one?
This one is 59. This is the
okay.
The mapping.
All right, so let's start with this one. I guess I wish, unfortunately, Tracy is not here, and Tracy Harvey put this table together. She was on the work group with us, and I may not explain it very well. Maybe Mark can help explain a little bit if I put him on the spot, if I stumble on some of this. I did something different that tries to capture this, and I'll try to explain what this tries to do. This tries to correlate, again, when we're talking about chapter 3 and the mapping of your finding of fact. In other words, does a project in your jurisdiction fall under the scope of the Wildland Urban Interface Code? You know what I'm going to do, Stoyan? I might actually take over from you in just 10 seconds.
Are you firing me?
No, well, I want to do a split screen that may be a little beneficial.
Okay, I will stop sharing that.
Again, the keyword is may. It may be horrible at best, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. So let me know when my screen pops up and if it's split and you see everything. Okay, great. So if we talked about before, when I mentioned chapter 3 and the mapping and how it ties in. So there's no correlation between the WUI code and what's on the DNR mapping, although you're supposed to use the DNR mapping to determine if you're using the WUI code. How do we do that? So this table on the screen, and the next one is a table as well that's going to kind of walk through this. So again, the biggest concern is, one, if someone wants to, an applicant wants to verify if they are in the red or the green and dispute that. That's one option. Or if you get a project that is within the green area, okay? In other words, it's vegetated, it's uninhabited. Okay, that's the green. If you look here on the legend on the left, if you're following my mouse, that's the legend of the colors. Okay, so if I zoom in, let's go here, and I don't know where this is. So if it's somebody's jurisdiction, I'm not picking on you, not pointing it out, but I'm giving you some information. So the intermix is the yellow, and outside this intermix is the green. Right now, the WUI code does not apply to the green area. So, because technically there's nothing there, it's just vegetation. So if somebody comes in and wants to build there, how do we determine that? How you determine that is based on the number of structures and the percentage of vegetation. So if you come in and you put a structure there and you analyze that parcel, say that parcel is 40 acres or less than 40 acres, that's how it's based off of from DNR. They provided what they call a raster that says this is how you determine what color is what. Green, uninhabited, vegetated area, you got to build inside it. You got to determine whether or not it's in the interface or intermix, or if you're going to classify it some other color. In other words, if it's non-vegetated inhabited, you see those gray areas, that's say city centers, stuff like that. WUI code doesn't apply in those areas. It's only the red and the yellow. So if you're going to determine what's happening in a green, you got to figure out what color it's going to end up being. With that, you're going to determine your structure density. In other words, if it's green right now, there's 0 structures. If you put one structure on it, you're going to either move into red, yellow, or some other color. Gray depends on your vegetation percentage, which is either 50%, less than 50%, 50 to 75%, or greater than 75%. Or if you are less than or equal to 1.5 miles to an area that has 50% vegetation. That's kind of what this table explains here. Again, I didn't develop this one, and I don't follow it as well. I think Mark indicated the same. He didn't follow it as well, and maybe he can jump in and say, this is what we were trying to do. Mark's got his hand up. I can't see everybody the way I could earlier. Go ahead, Mark.
See if I can get my video to come on so you guys know. Apparently not. Camera's not working. So I, like Micah, struggled with this one. I understand what Tracy was trying to do, but it was challenging, particularly the idea that, you know, there's no structures in green. It doesn't, WUI code doesn't apply because there's no structure there. But as soon as you put one there, then it's, you know, how do we deal with that? We're trying to come to a conclusion on that, and I'm not sure that this would be very easy to implement as a local jurisdiction. So from that, it's a little hard for me to advocate for this. And then the second part that Mike hasn't really talked about is table 302.2.1b. That table kind of short circuits what's in chapter 5 and takes you to ignition, resistance class, construction categories without going through that process. It's in chapter 5, and that's probably not fair to the WUI code and the process or RCW 519.27.560. So that's kind of where I think we both struggled with this. This would be like extra simplified, but in my opinion, departs the requirements of 560 enough that it would be problematic to implement.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. And I'm going to leave it at that. Like I said, I really couldn't explain this one very well. I didn't develop it. The next one I did develop, and I think it explains it a little better in a more simplified method. But let's discuss this one, and then we can move to the next one. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, remind me what vegetative density definition is here. Unless you're living on sand dunes or talking about sand dunes, it's all 100%, you know, from a naive interpretation.
I don't know if I have that. And I don't know if you can see that I changed my screen. I'm looking at the WUI code raster. and I'm not sure that they talk about that. I think the vegetative density, where are you? Goes into some of the fuel modeling that's part of the WUI code. And currently there are appendices under that fuel modeling. I think we were making chapter 8 that talks about fuels and fuel loading and whether it's a heavy, moderate, or low, stuff like that. So there's a whole process to determine that vegetation density.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, yeah, it's buried in there, and that's probably one of the problems with that table is that if you go to that expecting it to get, you know, an answer out of it, then you're going to ask the question, what is your vegetative density? And then you're going to have to burrow down in to find that.
Right.
Maybe there's another metric that should be used there. Fuel load or
I think on that, the metric you're talking about, though, is not controlled by us. That was done and controlled by DNR on vegetative density. And I think it's a standard in development of wildland urban interface mapping across the board, not just in Washington. So that's not controlled by me. That's the term they use for determining it. And I don't have an answer on how to define that for you, Peter.
Okay, well, that's a problem for the user, right? I would think so.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Chris?
I just want to concur with Peter. Yeah, we need a definition, something that we can, is it grass? Is it shrubs? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay. I want to say that DNR has that information. I just don't have quick access to it. I know this has been brought up before and I'm trying to find it as I talk. And so if I flip screens and do other stuff, bear with me. Go ahead, Dave. I think you're muted, Dave.
Yeah, I think this would be a very useful tool. I just think without the definitions, maybe it would be difficult to use. I'm thinking though, am I characterizing this correctly to say that this is I guess a specification or a word description of how that map is arrived at with the colors and so forth? And if so, maybe until it was hammered out, maybe it's better used in an appendix or something. I mean, it's a great explanation to be able to prove your case, I guess, if you're a private party or a jurisdiction.
Right. I think that the next one will help kind of clarify that. But yes, I
Okay.
think it's a tool just to use on your fact finding to determine whether or not you fall within the WUI code at all.
Okay.
And this one's not clear. So I had to present this one. Tracy unfortunately wasn't here, and I couldn't follow this one when she originally brought it. But again, we submitted it as part of the work group because she asked us to. But again, I'm not sure it's really clear, but I want to tag to know that there's a couple of options for this, and we're going to get into the second one in a few minutes. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit from Tracy's standpoint of
Yes.
what she's trying to project here. And if you're not able to do it, Micah, I'd like to hear from her. So if she can't make it to the next tag meeting, we'll move the proposal.
Can you not hear me?
But I'd like to hear by the next tag meeting.
Tracy's on.
Is Tracy on?
I can hear her.
Okay, I'll try and call back.
No,
I
you're
didn't.
good. We hear ya.
Loser? I didn't see a name. I would have called on her. That'd be
Yeah,
awesome.
I haven't seen that she's been on. I haven't seen her name on the list.
I thought I heard her. Unless I'm going crazy. But
I hear her a lot.
I bet you do, Dave. That's
Yeah,
fine.
I think that's rather than put down the proposal all through this. Let's not just judge it at this. Let's allow her the opportunity to provide
Yeah, absolutely.
her part of
I
that and move forward to the next proposal.
100% agree with you there. All right. So while we're waiting for Tracy to come back on, I'm going to stop sharing real fast. I think I'll prepare to share the next one if that works. Oops, I did the wrong thing. Stop that. I keep hitting the wrong buttons. Oh, come on. Okay. I'm going to share screen again. I apologize to operating too many screens. I should have let Storian do it. Right, Storian? I really didn't fire you. I just have it on screen. Okay. So let me know if you can see that split screen. I can't tell. It does say I'm sharing, but I want to make sure everybody sees that. Okay, got thumbs up. So I went through and tried to create something similar to what Tracy had done, and it helps with the fact finding based on the mapping. Again, you see the mapping at the left with the various colors and the legend that talks about those. When you look at the wildland urban interface, the 40 acres is parcels that they base this on, you know, doesn't include the water. And then it gets into all the different items, you know, what you mentioned about the vegetative density. That's what they base it on. Again, I think that's part of the WUI code, and they have some information on that we can hopefully get before the next tag meeting. But this kind of does a simple breakdown similar to what she was indicating, but this is based directly from DNR and the presentation they provided. So how do you determine if you're in the wildland urban interface code? First step is to determine structure density. So again, if you are uninhabited, whether it's vegetated or not, is 0. So there's a non-vegetated, uninhabited on the map. They're few and far between. It's brown areas. I could go to the map. I might make you seasick trying to get there. But there is non-vegetated, uninhabited areas on the map. There's vegetated, uninhabited areas. But really is what you need to determine first is whether or not you've got structures. If there's 0 structures, you're uninhabited. That's 0. That's the first step here on determining your structure density within that 40-acre parcel, whether that's smaller than 40 acres as an individual parcel for, say, just a 1 acre or less or whatever. If it's going into the green by itself, you got to address 40 acres that surround it, is my understanding. So not just the 1 acre, you got to do 40 acres. So if you have a structure, you're going to be very low density, 0 to less than or equal to 1. I know, how do you get a less than 1? Well, I don't know. That's part of their presentation and how they got here. So we'll leave that up to them. Then if a low density is greater or equal to 1 and 8, up to 8 structures, then you have medium density and high density. Those will help determine a couple of other things, but that determines whether or not you're inhabited, very low, low, medium, or high. And again, this is based on the information from the mapping and how you understand the mapping and how you get there. The second part you have to determine to find, again, if you are within the WUI code. In other words, if you're an intermix or you're an interface. If you're still one of these other things that are not those 2 items, you do not fall within the jurisdiction of the Wildland Urban Interface Code. So that's what we're determining with this kind of map spreadsheet here. The second thing you have to determine is your partial vegetation density. Again, you're going to go either greater or less than or equal to that 40 acres. If you're less than 50% vegetated and greater than or equal to 1.5 miles to an area that is greater than or equal to 75% vegetated and does not overlap the water, you are considered non-vegetated. I think that's kind of leads to kind of Peter's question of how do you determine what's vegetated? There's going to be some of that fuel loading in there that's going to determine if you're vegetated. And that's kind of outlined in the WUI code. But this is straight from how do you read the DNR mapping? This was part of their presentation, and this is what I pulled from it. If you are vegetated, you are going to be greater than or equal to 50% vegetated on the excuse me, on the parcel or the less than 40 acres, and have a structured density of uninhabited or very low. Why they had that on there, I don't know. That would be something DNR could help present to us if necessary. Maybe we need to read, maybe Guy on here can have an answer for that. But you're considered vegetated if you're greater than 50% or have structured density of uninhabited or very low. So you have to have both of those to be considered vegetated, my understanding. Peter, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm pondering the meaning of not overlap water, right? I'm guessing that's a mapping kind of
Yeah, so
problem is that if you choose your 40 acres and you have to choose the 40 acres, it doesn't include water, I guess.
yes,
Is
so
that how that's over, that's interpreted that? So,
that's my understanding of it. So I kind of scrolled in on the map a little bit. If you see the blue area next to the
Right.
yellow area. So if your parcel, let's say right here on the edge of this blue area, and it's only an acre, but you have to address 40 acres, that 40 acres does not go into the water. It's 40 acres on land, more or less.
by the way, you can go up to the legends and change your transparency so you can see the underlying structure there. But
Okay.
so, you know, that's helpful because this is difficult to read with just the colors. So
It is very, and of course, there's no real parcel lines on this when you even scroll in or be transparent either. So that's one of the other complaints from the
Right.
jurisdictions. Okay.
Okay. All right.
So once
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Once you determine your structure density and your vegetation density, then you're going to say, okay, I'm using both of those to determine if I am in the WUI code or fall within the WUI code. The answer is yes or no. I'm in it or I'm not. If your structure density is very low to high, and you are in an area that is greater than or equal to 50% vegetated, you are in the WUI code. It applies. If you have a structure density of very low to high, and you're in greater than or equal to 50% vegetated, and you're less than or equal to within 1.5 miles of density of vegetation density that is greater than or equal to 75% and not overlapping water, yes, you are in the WUI code. Same with the last one. I don't need to read all of them. I guess you all can see the screen. So the last one is kind of the one that people didn't understand a little bit. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're vegetated or not. If you have a structure density of very high to low, and you are less than or equal to 1.5 mile distance from that area that has a greater than or equal to 75% vegetated density, then you are within the WUI code. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, I just want to affirm a definition on vegetation, because most jurisdictions are a maximum of 40% of lot density is allowed to be impervious. So most of the time, 60% is vegetated by grass. And by that definition, anything within these areas would be WUI code if vegetation is considered grass. So I want to understand that and make sure that DNR properly defines that as well.
Okay. And I'll need to do some outreach, and I know that information's out there, and I'll be more prepared in the next meeting to answer that question on vegetation density and what they consider it as.
Yeah, because some of the rural areas are not necessarily in the WUI, but rural open space, where 50% of the parcels required to be open space with potentially grass and non-actual plantings, vegetation. So
I think that they do identify that. I just don't have an answer to how, and that's where you fall into the brown areas, which they're considered non-vegetative. And so I'm going to scroll out, sorry to make people sick, but it does, I think, get into that coverage of kind of the eastern part of the state where you get into those grasslands. So see, if you see here, there's a lot of area out here that has brown in it. That's considered non-vegetated area per DNR. So they do have something that will answer this question. I just don't have it. I apologize.
okay, thank you, Mike. I just wanted to affirm again that request is noted.
Yeah, that sounds like a real important one for everybody, is to identify what vegetation density actually means and how it's classified. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, Micah. Just my observation of what other states have done, and understand the difficulty looking at your maps, and your explanation are good with the complexity that it is. The whole point with asking DNR to do the mapping was to help create a tool that you could apply the are you in the WUI or you're not in the WUI easily. Now, knowing that many states use the National Fire Danger Rating System, it describes types of vegetation. And I think your commenters are totally on key with, well, what kind of vegetation are you talking about? Are you talking about grasses? I don't have an answer for you, just other than I have a lot of compassion for this portion of the wrestling match, which is this map.
Okay.
Thank you for letting me just make my comment.
Thank you. I do want to point out that what Craig Stevenson talked about on the fire danger rating system, that is part of Appendix D of the WUI code. And that does talk about the fuel modeling key. And I think that kind of will answer some of the vegetation questions from folks if you get a chance to review that section of the WUI code. I don't think that has changed significantly from the 2018. So you can find the 2018, I think you find the 2021 WUI code version for free views online through ICC. So Peter.
When I was looking at the map you just flashed up there, you have me on there basically in the bottom left. A lot of that appears to be farmland, and whether or not farmland is vegetative or not is a real question out here. Oftentimes our farmlands are far more flammable than the grasslands around them. So this is really quite confusing in many respects. I'm having a great deal of difficulty trying to use these tables to determine these things. So just a comment, again, what do you do with farmland as opposed to grassland? A wheat field and a cheatgrass field are essentially both the same flammability. So depending on the time of year.
I agree. That's what we're trying to clean up here to some extent and provide some direction. There's nothing out there at this point, and that's why so many folks have said, hey, how do we do this? And again, kind of what I'm showing here is kind of a simplified method to do that. However, it may not be the magic bullet. So go ahead, Dave, and then Mark. Excuse me.
So I'm trying to take the two proposals together because I think that there's validity for each of them. One of the things that you're doing here that the typical code reviewer does not have, he's not going to have the map. And what you kind of missing out of this proposal is, okay, it's a yes, but what color is it? And you have to have the map with it to be able to see that, but somebody's going to want to just be able to know in the code here, if I'm green or yellow or red. So if I'm red, yellow, then I know I have to meet these requirements. So we don't say that here. That was clearly stated in the other one, provided a good separation. Otherwise, somebody's going to get through this and say, well, I know how the map was now put together, but where do I fall? So I think there needs to be a compromise between the two proposals to come together.
I was going to say, yes, I agree with you somewhat there. I think what I've got here on the screen does kind of say, yes, I'm WUI code, or no, I'm not WUI code. And it gives that down here when we get to number 4, it does help you identify whether or not you're an intermix or interface, which would mean you're either a red or a yellow. I think we'll get there. I do think there could be some additional correlation or some language added to this. Again, this was just a method of trying to provide some information on how to determine where you are or what you are based on the mapping, because there's nothing now that gives us guidance. So Mark, go ahead, please.
So I would lead with, as part of the work group, I was at, let's use the map. And if you think that you're not correctly classified in the map, that's a shame, but go ahead and comply with the WUI requirements regardless. I'm looking for my local jurisdiction for a simple way to implement this part of the code. That being said, we're pretty urban suburban, and we don't have a ton that's covered in our jurisdiction. There was a strong need, a strong desire in the group to have an alternative, to create a framework for someone to present a case that says, okay, the map shows my parcel included, but here's an objective approach to clarifying that it's not, without going through the DNR and revising the map. And so from that point of view, this proposal does that. It gives a logical framework that could be applied. They could have a consultant, your applicant could have a consultant present a case that says, look, we're not in WUI based on the framework that's in the code, and I support that. What I also support in this framework, which is coherently laid out, I agree also with other commenters that we need to understand what vegetative density means, because the whole thing turns on that. Point well made. But what it doesn't do is go on to that next section and imply that there is ignition resistant construction classification associated with being in or out. That's the business of Chapter 5. And so what I like about this proposal is that it does not do that.
Thank you, Mark. That's good feedback. I appreciate that, because I didn't think about that. So, all right. Kind of finishing up with item 3 there. Again, it kind of explains a little bit on the no answer. And Mark, you have your hand up again. Go ahead.
Sorry, just one more thing. Yep. This particular proposal is at least inferred in the earlier whole code proposal as well. It's in, I think it's in 302. Is that correct? In your in the one that we originally went through, this is sort of the default mode for that proposal. Is that correct?
I think so, yes, that it was trying to get to this in Chapter 3. Is that what you're asking?
Thank you.
And I'm sorry if I'm making folks sick with my scrolling. I don't know what it shows on the screen. I go to start doing something else. Hopefully it just stays with the same 2 things I was doing originally. So yeah, as Mark mentioned, this does tie into Chapter 3 on the fact finding. Again, you don't have to use this chart. If they just want to go straight to the map and it shows they're in a yellow or red, go do the things that we're laying out in 501.4 through 501.8, and you're done. However, if you have projects that come in and they're within a green area or something that is not shown as a yellow or red, and there's a determination that needs to be made, an applicant can use this table, or the code official can use this table to verify what the applicant says to them. And so that was kind of where this goes. It's probably not the end all be all, and maybe, you know, the engineer of record or whoever's doing the work for an applicant, or even the applicant themselves, doesn't need this information or this table to do that. But at this point, there, with the WUI code as currently written, there was no method of tying what's on the wildland urban interface DNR map to the code. And so this is kind of how that finding of fact is shown and how it works. And it kind of gives you an item number 4 on this table, saying if you're an intermix, it's this, and if you're an interface, it's this. And there's technically no difference in the requirements if you're in an intermix or an interface. You still have to meet all the same requirements of the WUI code. Dave?
Yes, thank you, Micah. I think it's a really good tool. I'm just looking just from a layperson's perspective for some language, maybe to kind of explain that a little bit in the Chapter 3 area. When you talk about findings of fact, is like, okay, the map is the map and the map is a tool, but here's another way to either prove that you're what to do if you're in green, or if you're a proponent, or if you're authority having jurisdiction. Yeah, I think just a little bit of a narrative or some sort of scoping language to kind of help out with that would be great.
Okay, that's a great point. I think that was something we talked about and we didn't necessarily develop. And so hopefully some of the folks on the tag can maybe propose some of that language with us. I know that the previous one that Tracy had put together, maybe that was some of what of Dave's point, is that some of that has narrative and this one really doesn't. And maybe we do need to work on developing some of that narrative. But again, hopefully this is just a helpful tool. And if that narrative will get us there, then we can definitely develop that. It's a great point, Dave. Thank you. All right. Any other thoughts or questions on this? And the table is complicated. This whole thing is complex. I mean, you can see why we're trying to do something just based on what's in the RCW. It doesn't make sense. I mean, you know, the code officials are saying this is really not enforceable the way it's shown in state language currently. So hopefully this helps. And I see Craig, you put a hand up, please.
If you feel that it's appropriate, if you're through most of your meeting, and then it would be appropriate for me to comment.
We got 5 minutes, so make it quick.
Okay, so just to summarize what I think I've learned by listening in today is that you really haven't lessened the requirements, because the base first way you interface with what's in statute is you do what's in statute, and you've put it in this proposal. This is the way it is. But what you've also done is you've provided a path that could be an alternative way of meeting the intent of the code, and also providing some relief, so you're not having to build a building that might have some features or might have fuels reduction beyond what might be reasonable if the state would have adopted better mapping to further define the fire hazard danger and better understand all the different fire resistive ignition levels. It's a way that a person could follow down a path and give them some relief from the requirements they're set in statute. That's what I'm hearing you say, although there's still some difficulty with understanding how to use the map. So from that standpoint, I commend that approach, because it's an approach that's not lessening what's said in statute. It's actually complying with statute, because that section of statute that says local jurisdictions can go and fully adopt the code, that could be interpreted as piling on requirements, but it's not piling on requirements if you're really ignition resistant 3. If you really only need fuels reduction by 30 feet instead of 50 feet or 80 feet, it's really providing people another alternative to only do no more than what they should have to do. Is that what I'm hearing from these proposals? Is that the intent of the proposals?
I think the whole idea is path clarity. I think that's the best way to sum it up, and I think you nailed it. That's what I'm taking from it anyway.
Well, thank you for allowing me to ask my questions.
Thanks, Greg. Chris, you have your hand up next. You might still be muted, Chris.
Oh, okay. So I'm looking at 560, and basically it says the following parts of 504 class 1 ignition resistant constructions are adopted. What I'm not seeing, and I don't expect you to explain it now, before your next meeting and the next time, can you show a clear path that says how you're going to get to the options? I'm just still not following. I like all the work you did here. It made a lot of it clearer, but I'm still not seeing that if you have a choice for this or you have a choice to do that. Just for next time.
Okay.
Micah, with that, just because of the time, I just want to clarify a few things. So Micah, we got through what we wanted to today, as far as an initial foundation to lay out, which is a great thing. From there, what I'd like to do is for, it's going to be next week, right, Stoyan?
Next week, I was going to ask you, we have two options, Monday and Tuesday. Wednesday, we have the BFP and MVE committees, so we can't use the Wednesday.
Micah, what's Monday, Tuesday looking like for you?
If you're talking Monday, I could do Monday morning. I'm already scheduled for the entire afternoon on Monday. And then technically I was scheduled to be on vacation for a week. So after that, I guess I'm somewhat open. So, but I will be participating from Idaho if that's the case. So it would have to be Monday morning or sometime that works for somebody else. Others, I'm not the only person involved. The tag
Sure.
And if other folks, you know where I'm at today. I presented what we have put together, and if you folks decide on something that's modified or changed and I'm not here, that's perfectly fine. You're the tag.
Okay, thanks, Micah. Stoyan, is it practical to have an agenda thrown together by Monday? I mean, are we okay with that?
This will be very easy agenda, so I can, yeah.
Okay, okay. We'll shoot for, my Monday is wide open, and so that would allow me to be there without worrying about a time frame. And so Monday's good for me. I'd hate to speak for the whole group. Is there a majority that likes or dislikes that?
Monday, 9 o'clock, Monday, 10 o'clock.
I'm traveling Monday, but Grant is the alternate, could certainly step in. If his schedule's open, I'm be in the middle of a flight most all day, so.
Okay, thank you for your flexibility, Steve. And I'm glad we have an alternate, and thank you for your input today. That was much appreciated.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's plan on Monday.
9 or 10 o'clock?
9.
9?
I'm not shy, Stoyan. I'll tell you when. Even though I'm not on the tag, but the earlier the better.
Okay. For structure's sake, Stoyan, would you like an agenda of specific items that are talked about?
No, I will keep the agenda simple. The agenda will have something like discuss code proposals,
Okay.
and everything I have will be posted on the website. So if you have modifications to Micah's proposals or different ideas, let me know as soon as possible, and I'll post everything on the website.
That's kind of what my thought process was. Okay.
It's I'm having a hard time with the links on the agenda. I'm trying to accommodate everybody, but I need to post the agenda earlier than when I receive some documents. So very often the links on the agenda are not the most current document. So I don't want to use the links anymore.
Okay.
Everything new will be on the website.
Okay, excellent. That sounds good. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, do we have somebody from the DNR who can attend Monday? Or was it somebody here, a representative from DNR who is familiar with the mapping stuff? I thought we had somebody on the.
Yes, we do.
Guy, are you able to?
This is Guy. I'm not familiar with that mapping project. I think that was done by Ashley Blazina, if I'm correct. And
Guy, will you?
I can check with what?
Could you please reach out to her and see if her or someone who is familiar with it could attend?
Yes.
That'd be nice.
And I'm looking at my calendar too. Yeah, I can reach out to her and see if she's available to attend.
Excellent. Thank you.
Can you send me the link to that map? Because I was driving while you were showing that map. But send me the link to the map so I can make sure we're talking about the same map.
Yeah, we'll get that out.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay. If we have that set, I just want to get through the rest of the agenda. Next agenda item is other business. Does anyone have any other business? Okay.
I don't, but thank you.
Okay.
I want to say thanks to everybody for listening to me talk for the entire time and providing their input. One thing I do want to mention as you peruse through this stuff over the next few days, just keep in mind that we haven't really implemented this at the state level, even though RCW went in. I know there's not been a lot of use of it or enforcement of it. So if we don't get it right 100% this time around, we do have the upcoming code cycles to where folks are identifying issues. We could change it in the next code cycle. I know that sounds kind of, an excuse of not getting it right. But again, I think there's going to be some items we're just not capturing because folks aren't using it as accurately as they should across the state yet. So just a piece for thought there. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Micah. And Dave, if you get a chance, maybe talk to Tracy and see if she can attend Monday at 9. I think that would be helpful to the group.
I will do that.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. And with that, we'll, unless Stoyan or staff has anything to add.
No, I was going to ask you if you can stay 2 more minutes
Yeah, that's fine. I'll put it on your tab.
Thank you. And, I apologize for, I sent you an email with idea of meeting on Tuesday, and then we didn't get enough folks for a quorum, and I changed it the last moment, so I apologize. Some of you got confused.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Diane.
With that, we'll go
Thanks,
ahead
Mike,
and
nice
adjourn.
job.
All right,
Thank you.
take care, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.